The disciples of the Manhwa sect stood in perfect formation, ready to start another brutal day of physical training. One of the disciples yelled as he struggled to push himself up from the ground in a push-up position. Meanwhile, Chung Myung, our protagonist, stood on a boulder on top of a disciple who was begging for the training to end. He looked at the struggling disciples and said that no one had died yet, so they could keep going. The disciple struggled to complete another push-up, the weight of the rock and Chung Myung bearing down on him. The man screamed as he tried to lift the rock, and right on top of the rock, Chung Myung sat casually, watching the man struggle with a relaxed expression. But to understand how they got here, we must go back to the Great War that happened 100 years ago. Chung Myung stood there, covered in blood. All around, bodies were scattered on the ground. He realized that the only thing left in this place now was death. Chung Myung called out, "Sayong Jangmun." He looked up at the sky. He continued to call out, "Saje." The man's voice was weak, barely a whisper as he spoke. He thought of the Sajals, a disciple of Asahyung. The place was filled with blood and strange energy, a testament to the savagery of the battle. Chung Myung was impaled by a sword, his white robes soaked in blood. Despite the mortal wound, he declared that they were all dead. Over 20 different sects, including the 10 great sects, completely wiped out. The ultimate military unit, composed of the elites, was gone. Their clash with Chunma resulted in complete annihilation. He wondered whose fault this was, concluding that it was all because of one man. The heavenly demon sat atop a pile of swords, like some kind of dark king surveying his ruined kingdom. He was the demon sent from the skies, the leader of the group that turned the entire world into a bloodbath. The heavenly demon was a terrifying sight. He was pierced by countless swords, but he remained calm and composed. The heavenly demon spoke, his voice echoing with a strange pity. He said it was unfortunate for the disciple of the Manhwa sect. Chung Myung was covered in blood, his white robes stained crimson. Below, the battlefield was littered with bodies and broken swords, a testament to the ferocity of the battle. Chung Myung's face was a mess of blood and sweat. He was clearly in pain, but he still looked determined, even as blood dripped from his mouth. The heavenly demon spoke, his voice echoing in the silence. He said that if the disciple had managed to survive, he could have bragged about killing him for the rest of his life. The heavenly demon continued, saying that it seemed this was the end for both of them. And right after, a brutal hand clenched tightly, as if trying to hold on to life. The heavenly demon finished, saying that the disciple had every right to be proud of himself. His voice was weak, but there was a hint of respect in it. The heavenly demon, barely clinging to life, admitted that even with help, his opponent's sword had reached him. He then declared that in his name of Chunma, he acknowledged the swordsmanship as Chung Myung's hand gripped his chest tightly, trying to stop the bleeding. He must have been in terrible pain. The heavenly demon finished his sentence, saying he recognized the Manhwa sect's swordsmanship as the greatest in the world. Below him lay a battlefield covered in bodies and broken weapons. Chung Myung, covered in blood and looking absolutely furious, screamed at the heavenly demon to shut up. He looked like he'd had enough. The heavenly demon looked up, his red eyes burning with intensity. He spoke with a tone of regret, saying it was quite a shame. The heavenly demon continued, saying that if he were given another moment, he would have been able to become a man, befitting the name of Hua Mo. But he accepted that this must also be his destiny. The heavenly demon, with a final breath, warned the Manhwa sect's disciple to remember. His eyes glowed with a menacing light. The heavenly demon declared that this was not the end. With his last breath, the heavenly demon warned that the demons would return. His eyes burned with a final, hateful glare. The heavenly demon warned that when that happened, the world would be taken over by demons. The warrior's hand gripped the sword tightly, the blade glowing with an eerie pink light. He didn't seem to notice the blood dripping from his wounds. The heavenly demon continued, saying that no one would be able to stop them. The warrior's face was covered in blood, his eyes barely open. He looked like he was at the end of his rope. With his last breath, the heavenly demon whispered about the demons. The warrior stood amidst the destruction, his grip tightening on his sword. The heavenly demon stared forward, his red eyes burning with an eerie light. Blood ran down his face, but he didn't seem to care. And immediately, a massive explosion of pink energy erupted. The force of the blast seemed to shake the very ground. Chunma stared down with a cold expression, and immediately, a dark figure plummeted downwards, disappearing into the darkness below. Someone lay defeated defeated on the ground, unmoving. At the same time, another figure walked towards the body, their steps echoing in the silence. The scene showed a figure standing atop a mountain of corpses. The warrior seemed to be the only one left alive in the area. Chung Myung's face was covered in blood and sweat as he cried. He looked like he had been through hell and back. He stood there, gazing up at the sky, which was now glowing with an eerie light. The warrior seemed lost in his thoughts, trying to make sense of the devastation around him. He turned his head, his eyes filled with a deep sorrow. The fighter's face was streaked with blood, a grim reminder of the battle that had just ended. Chung Myung stood atop a mountain of bodies, a grim testament to the battle that had just taken place. He knew that every single member of the Manhwa sect had lost their lives in this place. Not only the members of the Manhwa sect were gone, but their followers too had been killed. The battlefield was now a graveyard. The only ones left were the powerless children, unable to defend themselves. The weight of that truth was crushing. The wind howled through the battlefield, carrying the scent of blood and the whispers of lost souls. It was a mournful song for the fallen. If only he had dedicated himself more to training, maybe he could have saved at least one more life. The thought gnawed at him, a constant reminder of his failure. Broken swords lay scattered across the ground, silent witnesses to the carnage. They were the last testament to a battle lost and a war that had ended in the worst way possible. Chung Myung lay among the dead, the bodies of his comrades surrounding him. He panted, realizing that all of this bloodshed was meaningless. Chung Myung's breath grew shallow, and he felt the life draining out of him. He thought that even a plum blossom bloom must come to an end at some point. With his last breaths, Chung Myung thought of the Manhwa sect. He wondered what would become of it now that everyone was gone. He was the 13th disciple of the great Manhwa sect, one of the 3 great swordsmen, the Plum Blossom Sword, Saint Chung Myung. After killing Chun Ma, who had brought destruction and disarray onto the world, Chung Myung's life was coming to an end. He breathed his last breath there, on top of the heavenly demon sect's mountain. The ground was covered with the bodies of the dead. Turns out, that short story was the only thing he left behind in the world. All the fighting, all the sacrifice, it all came down to that. But then, a baby was born, a new life, completely unaware of the brutal legacy he was about to inherit. At the same time, at the gates of Manhwa, the elders looked down, worried. Below, the sect was a shadow of its former glory. Despite that, the disciples kept training under the plum blossom trees. They were trying their best to keep the Manhwa sect alive, even if they didn't know its true potential. Above, the other disciples watched, but didn't dare intervene. Down below, someone yelled at Chung Myung, calling him a brat. Chung Myung was stunned by the outburst. He wondered if his life was flashing before his eyes. The authority figure lectured the 2 disciples, emphasizing that they should be an ascetic practitioner before a martial artist. He added that power without ethics can only be regarded as violence. Chung Myung looked annoyed. Someone muttered that he was at it again. He was sick of it. Even though he had been a disciple of the Manhwa sect, he hadn't followed its teachings completely. He was getting attention he didn't deserve because of his talents, but he was just a rookie in the Manhwa sect. He wondered why he hadn't realized that back then. He thought about how everything he had came from the Manhwa sect. Then, Jang Mun's voice echoed, asking if he regretted his past. Chung Myung admitted that yes, he regretted his past. Sahyung Jangmun. If only he had been more dedicated to following the teachings from the Manhwa sect, he thought. And if he could have become even a bit stronger than he was, he could have changed the ending of this horrible tragedy. Jangmun looked down at him with a sad smile, trying to comfort him. He told Chung Myung that there was no need to regret anything because the Manhwa sect would continue. The words hung in the air, promising that no matter what happened, the Manhwa sect would find a way. The mountains of Manhwa stood tall, covered in trees with pink flowers. It was a beautiful sight, full of hope. The words echoed again, stating that there would always be the Manhwa sect. It would never disappear. Chung Myung looked up, his eyes shining with a new resolve. He knew what he had to do. The small building stood quietly under the open sky, looking worn. Everything seemed calm for now. Someone reached out, shaking a figure awake. The voice shouted, asking about Chun Ma and how that could be possible since he was supposed to be dead. The person who was sleeping sat up, looking around with a dazed expression. He mumbled the name Chun, as if trying to understand what was happening. Standing over the sleeping figure, someone held a bamboo stick. He yelled that the other person was talking crazy in his sleep, calling him a bum. Now fully awake, the person sat up, his face still showing confusion. He asked why everyone had already left to beg, and what was going on. The man looked absolutely furious. He couldn't believe that he was being threatened after someone someone had the nerve to laugh at him. The man on the ground tried to calm things down. He asked the guy with the bamboo stick to put it down, saying he didn't understand what was going on. But the guy with the bamboo stick just laughed at him. He didn't seem to care at all. The man sitting on the ground was beyond confused. He started laughing too, saying that none of this made any sense. Chung Myung was getting angry. He was Chung Myung, one of the Plum Blossom Sword Saints, someone even the leader of the Beggars Union respected. And yet, this little brat was acting like this. The guy with the bamboo stick was beyond furious. He yelled that the man was dead to him, promising to teach him a lesson. And immediately, he swung his weapon down with full force. The man on the ground wasn't scared at all. He planned to block that slow swing, completely confident in his ability to defend himself. But something was very wrong. The defender's eyes went wide. He was completely confused. Looking down, the defender realized something was horribly wrong. He wondered why his arm was so short. What the hell was going on? He stared at his hand, completely shocked. He couldn't believe it was so small. It just wasn't possible. The defender realized he couldn't block the attack. His arm was too short to even reach. The attacker was beyond angry. He screamed that the other guy was a total bastard. The attacker didn't care if the defender understood or not. He was going to make sure he understood, even if it meant beating him senseless. The attacker shouted that everyone had a limit to how much nonsense they could take. He promised a good beating would knock some sense into him. Someone screamed in pain. It was a long, drawn-out shriek of agony. The attacker was on his knees, looking up at Chung Myung. He begged him to spare him, promising to come back later. He wiped the blood from his nose, making a sound of disgust. The beating had really messed him up. Sitting by the river, the attacker grumbled about how much he hurt. He couldn't believe he'd gotten beaten so badly, even back in the Manhwa sect. He called Chung Myung a damned bum brat, even if it was for the sake of that brat. He'd make sure to take care of the beggars of the Beggars Union. He was trembling with anger at the thought. Anyway, the attacker just kept walking, deeper into the water. He was probably planning his next move. Chung Myung stared down into the water, lost in his thoughts. He hadn't expected to end up in this situation, not after everything that had happened. He stared at the reflection staring back at him. Chung Myung wondered who this child was that he saw staring back at him from the water. Chung Myung touched his face, trying to make sense of everything. He asked himself what the hell was going on, and if this was the reincarnation that was mentioned in Buddhism. Chung Myung thought he would have entered the Shaolin temple instead if he knew this was going to happen. He was starting to regret his choices. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice someone approaching. Suddenly, a voice called out, "Hey!" The guy who had been getting beat up earlier approached Chung Myung, asking if he was okay. He explained that Wang Cho always acted like that, but today he had really gone too far. Chung Myung raised a finger, stopping him mid-sentence. He said that he only had one thing to say. Chung Myung paused for a moment, then raised another finger. Actually, he corrected. There were two things he wanted to ask. Chung Myung stared intensely. His eyes narrowed. The other guy looked back, completely confused by the sudden shift in mood. They stood there near the river, the sound of the water flowing around them. The tension was thick in the air as they waited for Chung Myung to speak. Chung Myung's eyes narrowed as he thought about his situation. He wondered aloud if he had really fallen so low as to become a beggar. The other guy looked at Chung Myung with a mix of amusement and pity. He pointed out that it was pretty obvious he was a beggar just by looking at his clothes. Chung Myung was shocked at the realization. He yelled, wondering how he could possibly be a beggar. Then, he quickly composed himself and said he had a second question to ask. The other guy looked even more confused. Chung Myung suddenly asked if he knew who Chun Ma was, adding that he had thought the guy was acting pretty normal for someone who had just been beaten up. Chung Myung's patience wore thin. He demanded that the other guy just answer him, calling him a bum. Then he sighed, calling him a bum again. The other guy looked up, thinking for a second. Then he said that, yeah, he knew who Chun Ma was. The other guy kept going, asking if Chun Ma wasn't the leader of the Heavenly Demon Sect. He added that Chun Ma had died 100 years ago, or so he thought. Chung Myung's face suddenly went pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was clearly shocked by what he had just heard. Chung Myung's eyes narrowed, his shock turning into something more intense. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Chung Myung shouted, questioning if what the other guy said was even possible. 100 years? That's insane. Chung Myung grabbed Jongmun, his grip tight. He demanded if it had really been 100 years since Chun Ma died, repeating the question in disbelief as he asked what Jongmun was doing. Chung Myung shook Jongmun, needing to know if all of this was true. Jongmun insisted that he was telling the truth, adding that there was no reason for him to lie. Chung Myung's eye widened, his mind racing. He just let out a trying to process everything. Chung Myung said that this was insane, repeating the 100 years in his head. He couldn't believe how much time had passed. past. Chung Myung wondered why he couldn't have been brought back right after he died. He added that this was almost like Chung Myung just stood there, staring up at the sky. He thought that he had been left all alone in this world. Jungmun looked at Chung Myung with concern, asking if he was all right. Chung Myung ignored the question, wondering how things could have gone so wrong, and if the Manhwa sect was also. Chung Myung's eyes darted around, his mind trying to catch up. He just let out a confused, "Huh?" Chung Myung's voice started to rise in panic as he asked about the Manhwa sect. He demanded to know what had happened to them. Jungmun stared at Chung Myung, clearly taken aback by the outburst. He asked what was going on. Chung Myung looked at the other beggar up and down, asking if he wasn't just a beggar too. The other guy just nodded, confirming that he was, just like Chung Myung. Chung Myung's face turned red with anger as he yelled, asking how the guy could be part of the Beggars Union and not know about the Manhwa sect, one of the 10 great sects. He demanded to know if the guy even knew what he was talking about. The other beggar tilted his head, completely lost. He wondered what kind of nonsense Chung Myung was spouting. Chung Myung started listing off the 10 great sects: the Shaolin Temple, the Wudang, Ashen Sect, Kong Tong Sect, Ching Cheng Sect, the Lotus Order, Southern Island Sect, Kunlun Sect, the Beggars Union, and the Southern Edge Sect. Chung Myung's eyes widened in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. There was no such thing as the Manhwa sect in the 10 great sects. It was like a punch to the gut. The message burned into his mind. The Manhwa sect wasn't part of the 10 great sects anymore, and immediately, Chung Myung's face twisted in shock. He couldn't believe it, asking how that was even possible. The news hit him hard, and his eyes filled with disbelief. The beggar stared at Chung Myung, clearly confused by what he was saying. He asked what kind of nonsense he was spouting. Chung Myung listed the 10 great sects. They were the Shaolin Temple, the Wudang, Ashen Sect, Kong Tong Sect, Ching Cheng Sect, the Lotus Order, Southern Island Sect, Kunlun Sect, the Beggars Union, and the Southern Edge Sect. Chung Myung was stunned as he heard that there was no such thing as the Manhwa sect in the 10 great sects. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The words echoed in his mind. The Manhwa sect wasn't part of the 10 great sects. It was a hard pill to swallow. Chung Myung's eyes widened in disbelief. He asked how that was even possible, completely shocked by the news. Chung Myung suddenly found himself being grabbed by the neck. He gasped, wondering if this was happening again. The beggar demanded, "The Southern Island sect? The Southern Island sect you said? Those country island bumpkins have become one of the 10 great sects?" He paused, then shouted, "Hold up, that's not what's important. The Manhwa sect isn't part of the 10 great sects anymore. The Manhwa sect." The beggar's grip tightened as he repeated, "The Manhwa sect." The beggar loosened his grip a bit, thinking out loud. He said that now that he thought about it, he thought he had heard that such a sect existed on the Shanxi province map. The beggar continued, "The Shanxi province map, right. It must be on the Shanxi map somewhere. Do you know anything about it?" He then admitted he wasn't sure about them being a part of the 10 great sects, but Chung Myung looked up, his mind racing. He was starting to get a really bad feeling about all this. Then the beggar said, "As far as I know, the Manhwa sect has already fallen." Chung Myung's face went pale. Chung Myung's eyes widened, refusing to believe what he was hearing. "It has fallen? The Manhwa sect has..." The beggar continued, "The sect that was one of the 3 most prominent sects in the world, along with the Wudang and the Northern Loyal family. The Manhwa sect has fallen?" Chung Myung screamed, unable to process the information. Chung Myung was left speechless. He was at a loss for words. Chung Myung groaned, clutching his head. He was really starting to feel the effects of that beating. Chung Myung sat up, still in disbelief. He shouted that he refused to believe it and needed to see it with his own eyes. Underneath him, the beggar looked down at him, clearly annoyed. Chung Myung clenched his fist, his knuckles turning white. He was determined to find out the truth, no matter what it took. Chung Myung shouted that he was heading to Manhwa. He didn't care what anyone said. He had to see it for himself. The beggar warned him not to go. He said that if Chung Myung didn't want to get beaten up again, he should just go back to begging. Meanwhile, Chung Myung just stared at the ground, lost in thought. Chung Myung yelled at the beggar to shut up, saying he was going to ask more questions and the guy better answer. But the beggar wasn't listening at all. He seemed lost in his own world. Chung Myung stared down at his hands, looking absolutely confused. He wondered what was going on with this body of his. Chung Myung looked up, his expression full of confusion. He asked what the name of this body was, hoping for some kind of answer. The beggar scoffed, asking why a beggar would even have a name. He said people just called them whatever they wanted. According to him, Chung Myung was Cho Sam. Chung Myung grimaced dismissed, thinking that Cho Sam sounded like a total beggar name. He then wondered about his age, guessing he was around 15 or 16 based on his skin. But how would a beggar even know their age? Chung Myung demanded that the beggar give him his name and the name of the brat who beat him. He asked if the beggar really didn't remember anything at all. The beggar finally gave in, telling Chung Myung that his name was Ku Chil. He added that the one who beat him was called Ku Pal, but they usually called him Wang Cho. Chung Myung just hummed in response. Taking in the information, Chung Myung warned Ku Chil to listen carefully. He declared that he repays favors twice as much, but he returns grudges 10 times as bad. Chung Myung told him to remember the name Chung Myung of the Manhwa sect. He promised that the next time they meet, he would return today's favor. Anyway, Chung Myung announced he'd be leaving now, and with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Ku Chil behind. Chung Myung turned his back to the beggar, ready to move on. The beggar watched him leave, probably wondering what to make of all that. Chung Myung stopped suddenly, looking around. He asked which way was the Manhwa of the Shanxi province. He didn't get an answer right away, so he sighed, looking up at the sky, and then he started running. He was going to get there on foot, no matter what. Chung Myung declared that he was running. He was going there by foot. He said that even in his past life, he didn't ride something as slow as a horse. Chung Myung's face was red and sweaty, but he kept pushing himself. And yet, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up. He was already collapsing. Chung Myung cried out that he was gonna die. He was flat on his face, panting. Chung Myung realized that this body wasn't fit at all, and he was already tired after running for only a few minutes. There was no way it was possible. Chung Myung would probably pass out and die on the way there. Chung Myung was still lying there, completely exhausted. So, how was he going to get to the Shanxi province, you ask? Chung Myung was lying on the ground, but he was already plotting. He thought to himself that this was where the trickeries of the great Chung Myung were going to come into play. He started laughing like a maniac. Chung Myung was fired up now. He figured he just needed to train himself in martial arts. The others probably didn't realize how amazing this opportunity was, he thought. Chung Myung knew that even those who had reached the peak of their martial arts skill had regrets. They regretted that when they were younger, they should have focused more on the fundamentals. He started snoring though. He also knew that they regretted that when their sahyung nagged them to train, they should have at least pretended to. He remembered those days clearly, and they shouldn't have been caught drinking the liquor their sahyung hid away. Oh, Chung Myung told himself to disregard the last one, because it was delicious. He couldn't help but smile at the memory. Chung Myung was fired up. He declared that he could do this all over again. Chung Myung figured he needed to find a place where he could avoid the world as much as possible. He decided this spot would do just fine. Chung Myung sat down in front of the tree. He wondered what he should learn first. The wind blew through the trees as Chung Myung thought to himself. At the same time, he knew he had countless theories of advanced martial arts techniques stored in his head, and that every martial art technique and the history of the Manhwa sect resided by his side. A leaf fell gently from a tree above. Meanwhile, Chung Myung knew tons of methods of inner chi cultivation techniques, and that if he didn't limit himself to just the techniques of the Manhwa sect, the amount he'd learn would easily multiply. Chung Myung looked up, thinking hard. Of all the martial arts techniques available, he was going to learn one first. Chung Myung paused for a moment, then finally spoke. He decided he would learn equilibrium. What kind of martial arts technique was this thing called equilibrium? At the same time, a book with the word equilibrium was shown. Turns out, it was a technique that was thrown away very cheaply in illegal street stores. As a result, someone paid a few coins for it. Chung Myung looked serious. He explained that his reason for learning this cheaply sold technique was because it wasn't a cheap technique at all. The Manhwa sect buildings stood proudly. It was explained that equilibrium was one of the beginner techniques of the Manhwa sect, taught to every new disciple who joined. The explanation continued. Equilibrium might not make you stronger, but it perfectly cleanses your body, getting rid of all the gunk. It was a fundamental technique, so there was no need to rush things. He needed to take his time. He needed to build a strong foundation. Only then could he build a tower of inner body strength. He focused on his hands as the blue energy swirled around them. This was where it all began. Chung Myung stared at his hands, carefully focusing his energy. He knew he needed to make sure to precisely cleanse the energy absorbed from his surroundings. It was almost like fixing a small misalignment in a big fabric, strand by strand. He had to be patient and precise. Chung Myung closed his eyes and focused entirely on the task at hand. He could feel the energy flowing around him, ready to be molded. He needed to perfectly cleanse any impure energy, and if he gathered the cleansed energy into the dantian of his body, the energy started to swirl faster and faster, gathering into a bright ball of pure light. He could feel the power growing within him. Chung Myung felt a surge of power as he sat there, finally done. It's done, he thought, feeling a sense of accomplishment. He knew that this dantian would be the foundation that would open up a whole new world for him. He jumped up, ready to go. A small but firm energy would roll like a snowball and eventually become an avalanche. No one would be able to stop. Shall I run to Manhwa now? He wondered. Then he paused, confused. Huh? Suddenly, Chung Myung tripped and went sprawling. Oh, right, he thought, face-palming. He had already used all of his energy learning the technique. Chung Myung groaned as he lay on the ground, completely drained. Damn it, he thought, annoyed. Equilibrium didn't help at all when he needed to use his body right away. Far away, a middle-aged man watched with a knowing smile. Chung Myung, you, he muttered, his expression unreadable. The man cackled, enjoying Chung Myung's frustration. He told him that he sometimes just forgot to use his brain, and then told him to get lost because he was getting on his nerves. Chung Myung was getting desperate. How in the world was he supposed to get to Manhwa at this rate? Nearby, the marketplace was bustling with activity. People were buying and selling, and horses were being led through the crowds. On the edge of town, a man leaned against a wall, resting. He seemed completely worn out. Suddenly, a voice called out, "Brother! Brother!" The resting man woke up, startled. What? He asked, confused. One of the beggars pointed angrily, telling the other that there was a rookie beggar stealing all their begging money. The other beggar listened, annoyed. The beggar with the bun asked if that was true. He was clearly not happy about it. The beggar with the bun decided that they needed to teach the rookie a lesson, and immediately, the two of them grinned, ready to cause some trouble. The beggar with the headband spotted Chung Myung and pointed him out. He sounded excited to get started. The two beggars approached Chung Myung, ready to confront him. At the same time, Chung Myung was still sitting on the ground, looking down. One of the beggars yelled at Chung Myung, calling him a little brat and asking if he was deaf. Chung Myung just sat there, not moving an inch. Chung Myung looked up at the beggars, asking if they were talking to him. The other beggars looked at him with annoyance. One of the beggars scoffed, asking if Chung Myung had just spoken informally to him. He figured the kid must have lost his mind so young. The beggar said he didn't know who gave Chung Myung permission to beg there, but since he was young, he'd let him go unharmed. As he said that, the beggar clenched his fist, getting ready to fight. The beggar demanded that Chung Myung leave everything he had and get out of there. But Chung Myung just stared back at him, not looking scared at all. Chung Myung was just trying to eat, but he couldn't help but think about what he had just learned. It was a lot to take in. The other beggars lost it, yelling that Chung Myung had no shame and were those trash were even stealing his food. They demanded to know who he was calling a bum, calling him a little brat. Chung Myung stood up. As a result, the beggars looked absolutely shocked by his sudden movement, realizing this kid was about to cause trouble. Chung Myung threw rocks at the beggars. Right after that, he held his arm, feeling the strain of the movement. Chung Myung muttered that his dantian wasn't perfect yet, but he figured what he just did would be enough for now. Chung Myung told them that he had already gotten used to this body. He said this was pretty bothersome, so they could all come at him at once. The man responded that Chung Myung was weak and couldn't hit very hard. He hoped Chung Myung didn't mind being beaten a little and called him a brat. The man ordered them to go kill him. The others responded, saying yes sir, and charged forward. The attacker immediately threw a punch, aiming to take Chung Myung down fast. Chung Myung took the punch right to the face, staggering slightly from the hit. Chung Myung didn't waste any time. He punched the attacker right in the face, and the sound of the impact echoed through the air. The attacker went down hard. The other guys just stood there, stunned as their buddy crashed to the ground. Chung Myung stood over the fallen man, taking a deep breath. He declared, "I am," Chung Myung shouted, his voice filled with pride, "the Plum Blossom Sword, saint of the great Manhwa Sect." Chung Myung's face was red with anger as he pointed at the others. "You damned bums!" The three men kneeled on the ground, looking nervous. One of them spoke up, apologizing to the guy who'd just beaten them up. Chung Myung looked at the guy, confused. He asked why they were calling a beggar chief. He was starting to wonder what was going on. The man waved his hands, apologizing again. He didn't mean to call Chung Myung a beggar, but it just came out that way. Chung Myung paused, gathering his thoughts. He was about to ask a question, hoping these guys could help him out. Chung Myung asked if any of them knew the fastest way to get to the Shanxi province. He needed to get there as soon as possible. The beggar laughed, finding the question ridiculous. He asked why they'd be living as beggars if they knew the fastest way to get around. The beggars kept laughing, finding humor in Chung Myung's ignorance. Meanwhile, Chung Myung was starting to think he'd asked the wrong people. Chung Myung chuckled, realizing he was barking up the wrong tree. He figured he should try another approach. The beggars kept laughing, not suspecting anything. But at that moment, Chung Myung grabbed one of them by the collar, looking serious. Chung Myung leaned in close, his voice turning cold. He warned the beggar that they might meet again, hinting at something bad. Chung Myung got right up in the beggar's face, looking absolutely furious. He warned that if he asked about something, the guy better have an answer if he didn't want to die. Chung Myung yelled at them to get lost if they understood what he meant. The beggars didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled away as fast as they could, agreeing with him. Far from the chaos by the river, the mountains stood tall and silent. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. High up in the Manhwa Sect, Hyunjong stood by the window, looking thoughtful, and then he spoke, addressing someone outside, calling himself the sect leader. Hyunjong announced that this was Un-am and gave permission for them to enter. At that moment, the door creaked open. The messenger stood in the doorway, looking a little unsure. He reported that a child was asking to meet with him, but that it wasn't important. Hyunjong seemed surprised by the news. He asked who this child could be, and immediately, a young boy appeared, doing some kind of hand sign. Chung Myung grinned, looking up at Hyunjong. He introduced himself as Chung Myung and announced that he wanted to join the Manhwa Sect. Hyunjong stroked his beard, considering the boy's request. He asked if he was serious about wanting to enter the Manhwa Sect. Un-am stepped forward, looking nervous. He admitted to Hyunjong that he had told him they weren't accepting anyone into the sect anymore, but that Chung Myung was desperate to meet him, so he brought him there anyway. Hyunjong and Un-am exchanged glances, unsure what to make of the situation. The room fell silent as they both stared at the kid, who was still holding that weird hand sign. From the outside, Chung Myung seemed to be smiling innocently, but that expression was hiding something. Turns out, Chung Myung was actually very irritated. To find out why, we're gonna have to go back a few moments. The walking stick sunk into the dirt. It was clear he had been walking for a long time, and the journey had taken its toll. Chung Myung was crying, tears streaming down his face. He finally made it, muttering that he had arrived. He looked up, his eyes fixed on the imposing silhouette of Mount Hua looming above. He said the name of the place like a prayer. Chung Myung grumbled about the shortcut those beggars had given him. It hadn't helped at all, but at least he was finally there. He swore he wouldn't forgive them if they ever crossed paths again. Chung Myung looked down, steeling himself for what was to come. Well then, he muttered, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Chung Myung gripped the branch tightly, his knuckles white. It's time for me to climb the mountain, he declared, his eyes fixed on the peak above. He took the first step, then another, and another, climbing the seemingly endless stone stairs. He grunted with each step, his breath coming in short bursts. His feet pounded against the rough ground with each step, the climb relentless, and immediately he was panting, sweat dripping down his face as he struggled to catch his breath. He grit his teeth, pushing through the pain and exhaustion. I'll climb like my life depends on it, he vowed, his voice strained but resolute. His hand gripped the rough rock, searching for a hold. As a result, small rocks tumbled down the mountainside as he pulled himself up, inching closer to his goal. Chung Myung continued his climb, his movements causing rocks to break loose and tumble down the steep mountainside. The higher he climbed, the more treacherous the path became. He was bruised and battered, but Chung Myung refused to give up. He thought that anything was possible if he was tenacious enough. He dug his fingers into the rough rock, pulling himself higher. The climb was relentless, but he wouldn't stop. Chung Myung shouted, his voice echoing through the mountains, declaring that he would climb Mount Hua. Nothing would stop him. Finally, Chung Myung reached the top, standing tall against the backdrop of the setting sun. He had made it, and he was ready for what came next. Chung Myung was breathing hard, trying to catch his breath. He managed to get out a weak, whoa. He looked around, eyes wide with panic. Where did it go? Chung Myung's gaze went up to where the Mount Hua Sect's sign should have been, but it wasn't there. Chung Myung grabbed his head, his voice rising in disbelief. The thing Young Jung-mun cleaned every morning. Squeak, squeak. Where did that thing go? Chung Myung was losing it. He shouted that he was going to go crazy right there. Someone inside called out, wanting to know who was there, and right then, the door slid open, revealing Chung Myung standing outside. The man peered out, looking surprised. He wondered if it was just a kid. The man asked if Chung Myung had come there alone, and how he had managed to climb all the way up there by himself. Chung Myung replied that he had just climbed up. Chung Myung looked up, trying to catch his breath. He said he had something he wanted to ask. The man was listening intently. Chung Myung asked if he was a martial arts practitioner from the Manhwa Sect. Chung Myung looked up at the man, his eyes shining with determination. He declared that he was right. The Manhwa Sect hadn't disappeared completely. Chung Myung looked surprised as the man spoke. He asked if he could come in for now, then apologized. The man explained that they weren't accepting any outsiders at the moment, but he added that it was probably too late to start climbing back down, and they couldn't let a guest of the Manhwa sect climb back down in the middle of the night. The man at the door gestured for Chung Myung to come inside. He added that Manhwa got very cold when night fell. Chung Myung's face twisted in frustration, and he let out a silent scream. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Chung Myung stared at the dirt floor of the training grounds in disbelief. He demanded to know what happened to the marble stone floor and what was wrong with the place. Unam tried to calm Chung Myung down, explaining that they were merely pieces of stone. He added that they must have sold them when they were in a dire situation. Unam then tried to reassure him that the training ground was very spacious and nice, but Chung Myung didn't seem convinced. Chung Myung's smile faded. However, he had a feeling there was more bad news coming. Chung Myung's eyes widened as he gazed at the crumbling remains of what was once the heavenly golden palace. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Chung Myung pointed a shaking finger, stuttering in disbelief. He was absolutely floored by the state of the place. Chung Myung stared at the empty space, a puzzled look on his face. He asked if something was missing there or if it had always been empty. Unam confirmed that it was pretty obvious. He explained that palaces once stood in the empty lot. He knew it was bad, and he was asking where they all went. Hyunjong laughed, trying to brush it off. He said it wasn't something someone of Chung Myung's age would know. Hyunjong admitted that it was pretty embarrassing for a martial arts master to say, but he guessed it was a wound of glory, or some nonsense like that. Chung Myung tilted his head, confused, but Hyunjong quickly said it was nothing, sir. The sect leader gestured for Chung Myung to follow him. He said it was understandable, and it wasn't like it was their fault or anything. He just wanted to show him something. He added that they probably had it the roughest, trying to keep the sect from disappearing until now. Every step was a struggle. They arrived at the Yuyuan temple. The sect leader pointed to it and said that this one seemed to be intact, at least. The Manhwa sect was a martial arts sect, so the guests had their own set of duties. Every member had a role to play. The sect leader told Chung Myung to go on in and prepare to pay his respects to their ancestors. Chung Myung nodded in agreement. Chung Myung stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide. Something wasn't right. He had a bad feeling about this place. He looked around the temple and his face fell. It was empty. There was nothing there. He started listing the missing items, his voice rising in disbelief. The golden candlestick that was given to ancestor Daitong Hak by the emperor of the Jin dynasty was gone. The hanging scroll, written by hand by the ancestor, the gold plating decorations, all gone, just like that. And the paintings that used to fill the room were all gone. The place was completely empty, stripped of everything that made it special. Chung Myung's eyes darted around the room, and he looked absolutely shocked. He stammered, barely able to get the words out, wondering if there wasn't something else that was supposed to be there. Chung Myung frantically looked around the room, his eyes scanning every corner. He was looking for a flower, he said, wondering where it could be. Chung Myung turned to Hyunjong, his voice rising with urgency. He demanded to know where the flower had gone and how Hyunjong knew about it in the first place. He looked absolutely furious. Hyunjong watched Chung Myung's outburst with a thoughtful expression. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully before responding. Chung Myung was not letting it go. He insisted that there had been a flower, a plum blossom made out of some strange white metal. He demanded to know where that flower was. The man smiled and casually revealed that they had sold it. He seemed completely unbothered by the news. Chung Myung listened as the speaker continued, explaining that they couldn't find a use for it. Apparently, it didn't suit their temple, and they were troubled about what to do with it. But luckily, they found a merchant who was willing to buy it at a good price. The words hit Chung Myung like a physical blow, and he dropped to his knees. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in. Sahyung Jong-moon looked down at Chung Myung with a sad smile. He confirmed the awful truth. The Manhwa sect had fallen, the white plum blossom of the nocturnal fragrance. It was one of the two sacred artifacts of the Manhwa sect, along with the divine sword of the violet dawn. This type of white plum blossom gave off a sweet scent at night, and it wasn't as showy as gold, nor as flashy as silver, but rather unpretentious. It was a sacred artifact said to hold the righteous spirit of the Manhwa sect. The news hit Chung Myung hard, and he exploded with anger. And these dumbasses sold it off, he shouted. Sahyung Jong-moon noticed that Chung Myung was on his knees and asked if he was all right. Chung Myung was starting to realize the gravity of the situation. He knew he needed to step in as soon as possible before they made an even bigger mess of things. He looked up at Sahyung Jong-moon and begged him to let him meet with the sect leader. He was desperate to get things back on track. Chung Myung looked up and yelled. He wanted to join the Manhwa sect more than anything, and with that, everything was about to change. Alright, so the story jumps back to the present. Chung Myung was standing there with the sect leader and another guy in front of Manhwa. The sect leader was saying something about him wanting to join the Manhwa sect. Chung Myung looked at the sect leader and confirmed that he knew about the Manhwa sect. He figured it wouldn't be easy to get in, but he had a plan. Chung Myung smirked to himself. He knew he had an entire scenario ready to go. He was going to make sure he got in. The thing is, Chung Myung was going to use the name of Chung Jin, who was lost in the middle of a war. He was ready to tell them the story he had come up with. Chung Myung's story was that Chung Jin fell off a cliff. Then a lumberjack found him and treated his wounds. It was all part of his plan to get into the Manhwa sect. Chung Myung's story continued, explaining that even though Chung Jin couldn't move right away because of his wounds, he still taught the lumberjack the Manhwa sect's martial arts techniques to thank him. And immediately, Chung Jin treated the lumberjack as his disciple. Chung Myung grinned, revealing his master plan. He declared that he, Chung Myung, was the lumberjack's descendant. This was it, the moment of truth. Chung Myung thought to himself that the best thing about this whole story was that he could set his own position in the sect. After all, if the lumberjack was his grandfather, then he'd technically be on the same level as the sect leader. He thought it was an amazing plan, if he did say so himself. Chung Myung smirked, thinking that he should be in a higher position than the youngsters. He was ready for them to reject him or ask him for a reason. The sect leader surprised everyone by saying he approved Chung Myung's entry to the sect. Chung Myung looked completely lost for words. He wondered what was going on, and all he could manage to say was, huh? Chung Myung was still trying to understand what he was hearing, but the sect leader interrupted him, saying that if he really wanted to join the sect, he should let him do as he wished. The sect elder was completely baffled. He reminded the sect leader that he had said he wouldn't accept any more entries to the sect, but the sect leader just brushed it off, saying he had changed his mind. The sect leader continued, saying that maybe this was their destiny. Chung Myung looked even more confused as the sect leader told the sect elder that they needed to show more suspicion towards strangers before accepting them into the sect. The sect leader finished, saying that whatever the reason this child had, he came looking for the Manhwa sect. He seemed to have made up his mind. Hyunjong smiled, saying they don't chase away a bird that has come to the eaves to avoid the rain. He added that they hand out food to animals who come looking for food in the winter. How could they deny a child who seeks entry into the sect so desperately? Hyunjong then ordered Unam to provide the child with a place to stay and prepare for the entrance ceremony. Unam agreed immediately, saying he would prepare everything right away. Chung Myung looked absolutely stunned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, and all he could manage was a disbelieving no. Someone started screaming about how their position was gonna be affected. They were plummeting downwards, looking terrified. The emblem of the Manhwa sect, a plum blossom, was displayed prominently. The sect was about to change forever. Chung Myung sighed, thinking he was gonna have to wear a third-rank disciple's clothing. He wondered what was happening with his life. Anyway, Chung Myung wondered what this place was. He thought he remembered this place being used as a guest room. It was strange to Chung Myung that this was a temporary place to stay for those scheduled to enter the sect. The Manhwa sect originally didn't have private boarding rooms. Those who newly joined the sect immediately formed a bonding contract with their teacher and stayed in their teacher's rooms. So, it meant that there were people staying in these rooms. Chung Myung paused, looking at the open door. Suddenly, a voice came from behind the door. Someone was asking who was there, clearly annoyed by the intrusion. The person's eyes narrowed, filled with suspicion. They were clearly listening intently, trying to figure out who was on the other side of the door. The door was flung open, and the intruder demanded to know who was peeking into their room. They accused them of being a thief, looking absolutely furious. The other disciples looked around, completely confused by the sudden outburst. They started asking what was going on and what all the noise was about. Gul was furious, yelling that the peeking brat had invaded his room. He asked why he had to go through such hardships. Suddenly, a loud voice boomed through the room, demanding silence. The person wanted to know what all the ruckus was about. The guy went on, saying it was still time for training, yet they were all causing trouble in the boarding house. He looked absolutely pissed. Immediately, the group bowed their heads, sincerely apologizing to Great Sasuk. They knew they had messed up. The guy asked who he was. Chung Myung told him that his name was Chung Myung. Great Sasuk told Chung Myung that he must be the newcomer in the White Plum Blossom boarding house. Great Sasuk told him to get some rest for the day since it was already late, and to make sure to participate in training starting tomorrow. Great Sosik dismissed the rest of the group, telling them to come back downstairs. They all replied, "Yes, sir." Jo-gul looked absolutely furious. He glared in Chung Myung's direction, clearly not happy about the interruption. Gul was furious that someone had been peeking into his room. He yelled that he would deal with the intruder later and make sure to teach him a lesson. Jo-gul just stared back silently, not sure what to say. Chung Myung just stood there, taking it all in. He figured he'd just have to deal with it. Chung Myung looked at the group, calling them the cute little successors of the Manhwa sect. He said that he would make sure to give them proper attention. Chung Myung smirked, adding that his kind of giving proper attention might be a bit different from others. He let out a little heh, as if he was planning something evil. He figured it was their problem, not his. Outside, the White Plum Blossom boarding house stood silently under the moonlight, unaware of the hell that was about to be unleashed upon its residents. Jo-gul stared right at Chung Myung, a strange smile on his face. He told him to take them off. Chung Myung looked confused, tilting his head slightly. He asked what he was supposed to take off. Jo-gul, surrounded by the others, didn't hesitate. He told Chung Myung to take off everything he was wearing. Jo-gul went on to explain that this was how men got closer to each other. He said they'd take off all their clothes, dance, get beaten up a little bit, and wouldn't that strengthen their affection towards their seniors? Jo-gul finished his weird explanation and stared at Chung Myung expectantly. He told him that if he understood, then he should hurry up and take them off. Chung Myung looked around at the group of guys. He had a question to ask. Chung Myung asked where the boarding house advisor, Eun-gum, was at. He added that the advisor didn't usually train in the afternoon. Jo-gul looked furious. He said that this little brat just couldn't stop talking. He changed his mind, deciding that they'd start with a little beating. Jo-gul stared down at Chung Myung. He told him to flex his neck muscles. Jo-gul cocked his fist back. He punched Chung Myung right in the face, sending him flying. The roof of the building shook violently from a powerful impact. The whole structure groaned under the sudden force. A crowd of people watched in stunned silence, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. What was going on? And immediately, the floorboards splintered as Chung Myung stood tall. The other students were sent flying, crashing to the ground around him. Chung Myung's face twisted in anger. He thought to himself, "Start with a little beating, you say?" The crowd of students recoiled in terror at Chung Myung's outburst. He screamed at them, calling them scumbags. The night air filled with screams of agony. The sound was so intense that it felt like the very sky was cracking. Suddenly, Chung Myung's voice cut through the screams. He called out, "Sahyung Yoon Jong." Chung Myung told them to put a little bit more effort into the massage. He said he was giving them special treatment because Yoon Jong was the great Sakyung there. One of the students replied that he would do his best. Chung Myung then turned his attention to someone else. He asked, "And you, Sahyung Jo-gul?" Chung Myung told him he wasn't going to hurt him, so he should come out. He looked absolutely furious. Chung Myung started asking questions, saying he still wasn't used to the situation in the Manhwa sect, and immediately, the subordinate replied nervously, saying that Sir Sajay could ask him anything. Chung Myung asked what happened to the Heavenly Golden Palace. He also wanted to know why the Manhwa sect was in such a mess. He looked serious, waiting for answers. The subordinate started to answer, but he was clearly nervous. He stammered, trying to find the right words. Chung Myung then asked if Sir Sajay knew of the Plum Blossom Sword Saint. He didn't wait for an answer before declaring that he was the Plum Blossom Sword Saint himself. The subordinate looked shocked. According to the Sasics, the Plum Blossom Sword Saint took a major role in defeating Chunma. The image of the legendary warrior loomed over the battlefield, a symbol of hope and strength. But after that, the remaining groups of the Heavenly Demon Sect went completely nuts and stormed into the Zhongyuan region. And for some reason, they forced their way all the way up to Mount Hua and set the entire mountain on fire. And because of the severe damage they took back then, they still haven't recovered the prowess they used to have. Chung Myung paused, trying to process the information. Wait, so that means the reason why the Manhwa sect fell is because of me? I hate my life. The elders had been discussing the Tai Yi Flummox sword technique, and it wasn't looking good. Turns out, the technique lacked Taoistic aspects and wasn't very powerful either. Gul didn't think it would be a problem to remove the technique from the Manhwa sect. He then asked Sajay what he thought about it. Sajay agreed, saying it certainly wasn't a sword technique that could be of any good use. He figured they should probably just throw it away, even though it was left behind by their ancestors. Another man suggested that, in order to prevent the children from taking an interest in it, they should just remove it from the library. That sounded like a good idea to everyone. They decided to do as he said and get rid of the technique. The conversation took a turn. Down below, Chung Myung was stuffing his face when he heard someone calling his name. On a different note, Chung Myung. Hyunjong looked at him, his expression serious. He said he hadn't called him there just to talk about about the sword technique. Hyunjong thought it was about time for Chung Myung to take in some disciples himself. It was a big step. Hyunjong then asked Chung Myung how he thought he should teach his disciples. It was a test of sorts. Hyunjong waited patiently for Chung Myung's answer. The air was thick with anticipation. Sahyungjong Mun looked at Chung Myung, trying to figure out what he was thinking. He asked what there was to think so hard about. Chung Myung didn't even look up from his food as he answered. He said he'd just beat them up first. Once he beat them to the brink of death, they'd make even the impossible happen. The room went silent after that. You could almost hear the cherry blossoms falling outside. And after that, Sahyungjong Mun never brought up the topic of Chung Myung taking in disciples ever again. It was probably for the best. Suddenly, someone called out for their Sir Sajay. It seemed like something was about to happen. Chung Myung was just starting to get comfortable when someone interrupted him. The subordinate stammered, telling him not to address him so formally. Sa-young. He corrected himself, calling him Sir Sajay, and then just Sajay. The subordinate explained that UN Gum, the boarding house advisor, had called him to the training grounds. He added that Chung Myung would also be participating in training starting that day. The training grounds were set. UN Gum stood on a raised platform overlooking the trainees, who were lined up in neat rows, waiting for his command. UN Gum's voice boomed across the training grounds. He yelled for everyone to prepare their blades. The trainees responded instantly. They drew their swords in unison, ready to begin their training. UN Gum roared at everyone to swing their blades. His voice was so loud, it felt like it shook the whole training ground. You could see the determination on the trainee's face as he prepared to follow the order. The trainees all swung their wooden swords together, yelling as they practiced. The sound of the blades cutting through the air filled the training grounds. Chung Myung watched the trainees with a strange look on his face. Beside him, UN Gum observed the training, waiting to see how the new recruits would perform. Chung Myung tilted his head, looking confused. He was starting to wonder what kind of training this actually was. Chung Myung watched as another trainee swung his sword, yelling something about hat. He couldn't help but ask what kind of sword technique this was supposed to be. UN Gum explained that the sword technique his Sahyungs were training with was called the equilibrium sword technique. It was the foundation for all other techniques of the Manhwa Sect, he added. One of the trainees practiced the sword technique. The wooden sword sliced through the air. Chung Myung looked absolutely shocked. He couldn't believe that was Manhwa's fundamental sword technique. What the hell are these dumbasses doing? He wondered. Chung Myung realized this training was doing nothing but hindering the children from getting stronger. It was actually making them weaker. Chung Myung thought this was like teaching them the alphabet using a complicated thesis book. The trainees continued to swing their swords, unaware of how bad their training was. The trainees continued to train, but Chung Myung knew that doing this might get them ahead for a short amount of time. A very short amount of time, that is. He wondered what good technique without proper fundamentals would bring them. It was like building a house on sand. Chung Myung thought that if they were doing it this way, they needed to at least try to teach them properly. Otherwise, this was just a waste of time. Chung Myung stared in disbelief. He looked absolutely furious. He looked up at the sky. Look how beautiful the blue sky is. The clear and cloudless sky is like the nothingness of the future of the Manhwa Sect. Chung Myung looked up, completely lost. He didn't even know where to begin with these guys. Suddenly, someone called out, "Sahyung." Jo-gul looked around, completely startled. "Yes?" The voice asked what else he was learning other than this technique. Jo-gul looked even more confused. Oh. The voice continued, explaining that after learning the equilibrium sword technique, they learned the sword technique of the 7 sages. And after that, they graduate from the Plum Blossom House and learn the Lesser Ching sword technique. Chung Myung closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. After learning all the basics, they were finally able to learn the sacred technique of the Manhwa Sect. Turns out, the technique was called the Tai Yi Flummox sword technique. Chung Myung looked completely lost and asked, "What?" The man then added that the Tai Yi Flummox sword technique lacked Taoistic aspects and wasn't very powerful either. Chung Myung, still eating, said that it was certainly not a sword technique that could be of use and they should probably just throw it away. Chung Myung suddenly yelled, reminding them that this was what they had agreed on. And yet, the technique they were learning was the Tai Yi Flummox sword technique? Are you kidding me? Chung Myung was absolutely furious and yelled, asking what happened to the 24 movement plum blossom sword technique and called them retards. Suddenly, a voice boomed from above, demanding to know who was chattering again. and ordering them to come up there immediately. The voice seemed to come from the main building. It was Joe Ghoul, looking back nervously. He mumbled that it was him, Sahyung Joe Ghoul. Joe Ghoul, trying to sound tough, told Chung Myung not to be so formal with him. He repeated, "Yes, Sajaya," in a less formal tone, trying to act like he was in charge. Chung Myung asked Joe Ghoul to do him a favor, but Joe Ghoul seemed a little unsure. He asked what kind of favor Chung Myung had in mind. Joe Ghoul then told Chung Myung to tell everyone to gather in front of the White Plum Blossom boarding house at 5 a.m. the next morning. He seemed to be enjoying bossing people around. Joe Ghoul continued, telling Chung Myung to also prepare the things he was about to tell him. He seemed to be getting more and more confident with each order. Joe Ghoul finished by telling Chung Myung to prepare 5 of those items per person. It was pretty wild seeing Chung Myung being ordered around like this. Joe Ghoul seemed a little unsure about what he was hearing. He asked if Chung Myung really wanted him to prepare those things. Chung Myung stared back at Joe Ghoul, a slight smile on his face. He asked if Joe Ghoul didn't think he could handle it. Chung Myung said he liked Joe Ghoul's enthusiasm, as expected. He then told Joe Ghoul that he could go now, waving his hand to dismiss him. Chung Myung watched as Joe Ghoul left the room. He had a lot on his mind. The system flashed a grim warning. Currently, the Manhwa sect had neither wealth, technique, nor talent. It wouldn't be surprising if the whole sect collapsed overnight because of that. Chung Myung thought to himself that out of all the things he could control, talent was one of them. He knew that the current third-class disciples didn't seem very talented, but Chung Myung continued walking, thinking that they did say 1,000-mile journey starts with a single step. He was ready to take that step. Chung Myung looked up, his eyes firm. He decided that bringing up these untalented Sayungs would be his first step. Outside the White Plum Blossom boarding house, the disciples were already gathering. They had no idea what was coming. One of the disciples yawned, clearly annoyed. He wondered what kind of Sajay made their Sayungs come and go as they wished. One of the disciples raised his voice, asking if the others agreed with him. He added that they probably weren't even in the boarding house last night. Chung Myung's voice cut through the air. He asked if he was the Sajay they were talking about. Chung Myung stood there, staring down the group. The air crackled with tension as everyone waited to see what he would do next. One of the disciples yelled at Chung Myung, asking if he didn't learn to respect his seniors. As a result, the other disciples braced themselves, waiting for Chung Myung to react. Chung Myung just stared at the disciple, his expression unreadable. He was thinking something over, but no one could guess what it was. Chung Myung's face suddenly lit up with a wide, innocent smile. He exclaimed, "Oh my Sayungs." Chung Myung bowed deeply, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. He went on, saying he was really sorry and that he must have been lacking in his understanding of his Sayungs. Chung Myung gestured towards the boarding house, his eyes gleaming. He suggested that as an apology, they should all have a little chat inside. Chung Myung put his arms around the disciples. He said, "All right now, let's head inside." The door slammed shut with a loud bang. The sound echoed through to the boarding house, cutting off the outside world. The disciples stood outside the White Plum Blossom boarding house, unaware of what was about to happen. At the same time, inside the boarding house, the disciples looked around, confused by the sudden commotion. The boarding house started to shake violently. It was clear that whatever was happening inside was putting a lot of stress on the building. The boarding house building was starting to shake, just slightly at first. At the same time, one of the disciples looked up, his eyes wide with shock as he realized what was happening. The shaking got worse. The whole building felt like it was about to fall apart. Suddenly, the doors of the boarding house burst open, and the disciples went flying out like they were shot from a cannon. They were all screaming. Ghoul turned to the other disciples, trying to keep things under control. He told them to be quiet, or else they'd wake the great Sasuk. Someone stepped forward, the sound of their boots echoing slightly in the quiet morning. It was time to get started. Ghoul grinned, his eyes shining with excitement. He announced that every morning at this time, they'd all be training together, addressing them as his Sayungs. The sun peeked over the mountains, painting the sky with the colors of a new day. It was going to be a tough one. Inside the building, someone was listening to the commotion outside. He wondered what all the noise was about. Ghoul frowned, realizing that no one had come to give their morning greetings. He sighed, assuming it meant everyone in the White Plum Blossom boarding house was still asleep. Ghoul started walking, his footsteps echoing in the quiet building. It suddenly hit him. There was a newcomer in the house. Ghoul figured they must still be asleep, especially after doing their strange rite of passage. He glanced through a door, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Ghoul decided he was going to teach them a proper lesson this time. He had been thinking that even if Joe Ghoul got a bit too wild, Yoon Jong would be there to stop him from going overboard. But clearly, that wasn't the case. Ghoul stopped dead in his tracks, a look of utter confusion spreading across his face. He didn't understand what was going on. The scene scene in front of the White Plum Blossom boarding house was a mess. Disciples were sprawled all over the ground, barely conscious. They were calling for help, some even mumbling for their moms, and great Sasuke, another disciple, barely able to stand, looked around in disbelief. He couldn't understand why everyone was in such a bad state and begged someone to save him. Suddenly, Ungum appeared, looking extremely concerned. He demanded to know what the hell was going on, his voice filled with urgency. Ungum's eyebrows furrowed as he noticed the disciples hesitating. He wondered what they weren't telling him. Ungum's expression hardened. What reason could they possibly have to hesitate in front of him? Ungum, the boarding house advisor. Jogul was completely out of breath. He looked absolutely shocked by what he was seeing. Jogul stammered, realizing something even more important. Behind everyone else, it was the newcomer? Chungmyung's hands gripped the wooden pole tightly. The muscles in his arms were straining with the effort. Chungmyung staggered under the weight, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was pushing himself to the limit. Chungmyung's face was contorted with effort, sweat pouring down his forehead, and right below, his legs trembled, barely holding him up under the immense weight. The rock fell from above, picking up speed as it hurtled towards the ground. The sound of its descent echoed through the air. Chungmyung struggled under the immense weight of the rocks, his muscles screaming in protest. He grit his teeth and counted. Chungmyung was at his limit, sweat dripping from every pore. He was pushing himself harder than anyone I'd ever seen. Someone called out, "Oh, great Sasuke!" And right below, another man looked down, thinking, "This kid." The voice continued, explaining that Sasuke was so worn out that his legs were shaking, and that was easy to see. His legs were trembling under the weight. The guy yelled for someone to bring Sasuke some water, right now. But then he immediately dismissed the idea, saying that wasn't necessary. After Sasuke gulped down the water, the man asked him to speak now that he'd quenched his thirst. What in the world just happened here? One of the disciples cried out, begging someone to save him from this nightmare. Chungmyung just smiled, saying it was nothing much. Chungmyung explained that it was just a little morning exercise they decided to do together. Since it was the first day, everyone must have been hyped up and pushed themselves a little too much. The man looked absolutely shocked, asking if they were really that hyped up. Chungmyung just turned around and walked away, leaving the man speechless. He didn't seem to care about the mess he'd caused. What was going on here? The man wondered why they were acting so scared of the kid. The man scoffed, asking if they really called themselves disciples of the Manhwa Sect, and yet they were scared of a mere newcomer. The observer thought he should probably give the newcomer a warning. The man confronted Chungmyung, asking how he dared. The White Plum Blossom boarding house had its own set of regulations. Meanwhile, Chungmyung just stood there, listening. The man yelled, asking who told him that he could sacrifice sleep time for training. He stared down at Chungmyung, waiting for an answer. Chungmyung suddenly said he'd stop. Then he looked up, confused. The man looked at Chungmyung, clearly not expecting that. He was probably wondering what was going on. The man's face turned red with anger. He decided to focus on the fact that Chungmyung had threatened his Sayungs. Chungmyung just smirked, seemingly enjoying the situation. He looked like he was up to something. The man hesitated, then said he couldn't do that. It would make everyone look like an idiot. The man thought that the third-class disciples were already idiots for letting a newcomer pressure them into training. He'd be the biggest idiot of all if he actually taught those idiots anything. Suddenly, the man paused, thinking about something. He spoke one phrase, 1 month. The man looked at Chungmyung and asked him to give them 1 month, calling him Great Sasuke. He seemed determined to prove something. Chungmyung smiled, full of confidence. He said he'd make sure to bring results within a month, no matter what it took. The man watched his Sahyungs training hard. He highly regarded their determination and respected them for it, since not a single one of them complained about the very demanding training session. The disciples looked at each other, trying to act tough. They all agreed that it was the right thing to do, even if they were scared out of their minds. Meanwhile, one of the disciples watched with a serious look. He figured that the others didn't dare to complain to Chungmyung, not that they actually agreed with the training. The disciple wondered where someone like Chungmyung had come from. He had completely taken control of the third-class disciples, but he intended to use that control for nothing other than training. The disciple thought it wouldn't be an easy task for Chungmyung. He wondered why he insisted on training every morning. Another disciple believed they could become plenty strong with Great Sasuke's teachings, but he figured they could speed up the process with more effort on their side. The disciple wondered if it made sense for them to sacrifice sleep for training. He figured Great Sasuke believed that there was no need for a reason in their training process, which was kind of insane. Great Sasuke asked what the most important thing was when treating their Sahyungs. The answer wasn't pretty, and it made him want to barf. dwarf? Turns out, the answer was courtesy. He knew that was important. Great Sasuke declared that he would regard his Sahyung's words as if they were coming from the heavens themselves. He was really laying it on thick. Great Sasuke wouldn't look down on his seniors. Instead, he'd keep his courtesy towards them to maintain the hierarchy. The guy was really serious about this stuff. One of the disciples admitted that Great Sasuke was the real deal. Below, the other disciples were running for their lives, clearly terrified. The disciples were completely under Great Sasuke's control. They were nothing more than ants beneath his feet. Great Sasuke told them that he was impressed with their determination to voluntarily participate in training at dawn. He was laying it on thick, but the disciples seemed to eat it up. Great Sasuke continued, saying that if they kept up these efforts, they'd definitely see great results. He told them to keep going, but then he paused, confused. One of the disciples looked up at Great Sasuke with a desperate plea. He begged Great Sasuke to save them from whatever hell they were in. The disciples were running for the hills, trying to get away from Great Sasuke. They were absolutely terrified of him. The disciples were begging for Great Sasuke to save them. They were in so much pain that they couldn't take it anymore. Great Sasuke told them it wasn't like he was going to kill them or anything. He suggested they all have a little chat back in the boarding house. The disciples looked absolutely shocked. They didn't know what to expect from Great Sasuke, but it probably wasn't going to be good. My dear Sakyungs, a few days passed by. Chungmyung sat cross-legged, completely still. A blue glow surrounded him as he focused his energy. He could feel his dantian, still small and weak, but at least it was starting to settle. It was progress, even if it was slow. While he was doing that, Chungmyung thought about what he'd learned about the Manhwa sect. Firstly, there was the White Plum Blossom boarding house. As he expected, it was basically a private dormitory. The boarding house had been thrown together in a hurry because there weren't enough people to form proper master-disciple contracts. Secondly, there was the sect leader and the Yun pedigree. Putting aside their personalities, they were weak. Their strength couldn't even be compared to the Manhwa sect from 100 years ago. Because their masters were so weak, the disciples were weak too. And on top of that, most of the third-class disciples had only joined the Manhwa sect to make friends. But Chungmyung was still focused and glowing with energy. He wondered why any of this would even matter. He knew that things were going to change now that he was here. After all, the great Chungmyung was back. Chungmyung tapped his foot impatiently against the floor. He was ready to get started. He looked up, his eyes full of determination. Becoming the strongest sect wasn't just a dream. It was going to happen. After that crazy training, the disciples tried to eat. They were all sitting at the tables in the dining hall, but they were so tired that even holding chopsticks was a challenge. The chopsticks trembled, unable to grip the food properly, and as a result, the poor vegetables slipped right off and fell back onto the plate. One of the disciples groaned, complaining that they shouldn't have to train so hard, that they couldn't even eat. He was clearly not happy about any of this. Another disciple shouted, begging Sahyung Jogul to say something to Chungmyung. He hadn't been able to use chopsticks for days, and it was driving him nuts. Jogul looked over at them, clearly annoyed. He told them they were talking too much, wondering what their problem even was. Someone started tapping their fingers on the table. They were clearly getting impatient, waiting for an answer. Jogul looked absolutely furious. He yelled, asking if they thought their Sahyung was their errand boy. The other disciples sat there, stunned by Jogul's outburst. He continued, asking why they didn't just go talk to Chungmyung themselves, since it wasn't like he was avoiding them or anything. Jogul lowered his head, trying to calm himself down. He knew he shouldn't have lost his temper like that. Yoonjong spoke up, asking if great Sahyung Sasuke could spare a bit of his time. He looked determined to get an answer. Sasuke agreed to speak with Jogul. The White Plum Blossom boarding house stood silently, as if waiting for what would happen next. They walked together through the garden, the cherry blossom trees providing a bit of shade. The air was calm, but the silence was heavy with unspoken questions. Sasuke turned to the disciple and commented that he looked refreshed. There was something strange in his tone, like he already knew what was coming. One of the disciples simply said, Sahyung, acknowledging Sasuke's comment. He seemed nervous, like he was trying to avoid the real topic. Sasuke asked what he thought of the Manhwa sect. The disciple hesitated, saying that it was a difficult question to answer. He was clearly choosing his words carefully. Jogul admitted that it would all be over for him once he decided to return to his hometown. But he turned to Sasuke, pointing out that he was planning to spend his entire life in Manhwa. Sasuke agreed with Jogul's assessment. Far below, the two disciples could be seen standing in the garden. Jogul confessed that he really thought the Manhwa sect was done for. He looked serious, like he was carrying a heavy weight. Sasek told him not to be so disrespectful. That wasn't something he should say so easily, he scolded. But Jogul declared that he had changed his mind. His eyes showed a new determination. Chung Myung, after he came here, things really started to change. It was like a switch had been flipped. Jogul admitted that even though they had been forced into it, he realized after the morning training sessions that he had never pushed himself this hard before. He was sweating like crazy, but he knew it was working. Sasek pointed out that Chung Myung didn't even seem tired, even though he was training way more intensely than everyone else. It was like he was built different. Jogul admitted that he wanted to try his best after seeing Chung Myung push himself like that. It was inspiring, even if it was also a little scary. The only sound was the soft shuffle of feet moving across the training grounds. The disciples were all pushing themselves harder than ever before, driven by Chung Myung's example. Yoon Jung stood there, listening to the other disciple. The air was still. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Jogul grinned, his eyes shining with determination. He declared that he wanted to try his best to become a master who could lead the whole world. Yoon Jong smiled softly, a hint of amusement in his eyes. He seemed to find Jogul's declaration amusing. Yoon Jong nodded, agreeing with Jogul. He told him that he shared his thoughts. Up in the tree, Chung Myung watched them. He seemed satisfied with how things were progressing. Chung Myung was laying in the tree, relaxing. He muttered that he had already convinced 2 people. Chung Myung thought that Eungum was also pretty easy to convince, but he knew that he still had a long way to go. Chung Myung was still up in the tree. He yelled for the sect leader to come out. Chung Myung looked confused. He didn't seem to expect what was about to happen. Someone was outside the building, banging on the doors. They demanded that the doors be opened immediately. A group of angry men stormed towards the building. They shouted for the sect leader to come out right away. The men were not backing down. One of them, holding a torch, demanded they get inside. He shouted, asking where the sect leader was hiding. The intruders pushed past the disciples, not caring who they shoved aside. One of the disciples tried to stop them, but they just yelled at him, asking if he had just touched them. Up in the tree, Chung Myung watched the chaos unfold below. He was surprised that they had actually broken through the gate of the Manhwa sect. He wondered what the hell was going on. The men continued to push forward, ignoring the disciples' protests. They yelled that they had waited long enough and couldn't afford to wait any longer. The attacker screamed, demanding to know when they would get their money back. He kept yelling, asking if they were going to pay them back at all. The air hung heavy with the unspoken question. Could the Manhwa sect really be in debt? It was a ridiculous thought. The sky seemed to darken as the words echoed. Could they really be in debt in this situation? The thought was terrifying. The mob outside the building was getting angrier. They screamed at the sect leader, demanding if he had no shame. They told him to stop running away and come out at once. The mob kept yelling for the sect leader, their voices echoing through the building. All that could be seen was the sect leader's feet, hidden behind the closed door. Outside, the angry men stood with their torches, waiting impatiently. Their faces were grim, lit by the flickering flames, as they waited for the sect leader to appear. Suddenly, Chung Myung's voice cut through the air, asking what brought them here so late at night. He stood above them, looking down with a cold stare. There's no doubt about it, he thought to himself. That man was indeed the sect leader of the Manhwa sect. Chung Myung's eyes narrowed, ready to deal with whatever came next. The sect leader stood there, radiating a sophisticated aura with every move and word. It was as if he was trying to act cool, but everyone knew he was just putting on a show. The sect leader was trying to act cool, but everyone knew he was just putting on a show. The sect leader was trying to act cool, but everyone knew he was just putting on a show. He was clearly trying way too hard. Someone from the crowd spoke up, asking the sect leader how he had been. The sect leader didn't seem too pleased to see them. The sect leader replied that he hadn't expected the pavilion owner Kong to come himself. Kong chuckled, saying he felt uneasy having to visit for something like this. Pavilion owner Kong started to explain that he didn't want to climb Mount Hua again if he could avoid it, but he added that many people had been asking him to come there, so he hoped that the sect leader would understand. The sect leader replied that they had to understand the reasons of these people, reminding him that the agreed date had already passed. He looked grim. Kong continued, saying that they had tried to understand the Manhwa sect situation multiple times already. He mentioned that if they followed the contract, they would be asking them to pay the price for violating the promised date, but they had been indebted to the Manhwa sect many times in their lives. Kong said that they would try not to be so harsh on them, offering them 7 days. He then warned that if they were unable to pay them back within this time, they would confiscate the temple of the Manhwa sect. He hiccuped. The crowd stood there silently. The threat hanging heavy in the air. The sect leader stared back at them, trying to figure out what to do next. Chung Myung was hiding, trying to stay out of sight. But then he heard the pavilion owner Kong say, "Looks like I let the child see something they shouldn't have." The building loomed in the darkness, silent and foreboding. So, what was going on in there? Inside, the men were waiting. One simply said, "Yeah." Chung Myung thought to himself that he was in trouble. He figured, who knows what he's gonna do to me? I should probably stay away. But then Sajay spoke up. "Isn't the Hua Prefecture the name of the village right below Mount Hua?" Young confirmed that was correct, adding that he remembered it from the days when he was peddling with his father. The disciple with red hair wondered if Manhwa Sect had borrowed money from the merchants. The other disciple admitted he didn't really know about that, but the disciple with black hair piped up, saying he knew about the pavilion owner Kong. He explained that Kong was the owner of the Tai Hua Pavilion of the Hua Prefecture. He added that he's the owner of the biggest pavilion of Hua and apparently a wealthy merchant who takes part in many different businesses. The disciple with red hair asked, shocked if he was hearing right. Was Kong really the owner of the Tai Hua Pavilion? The disciple with red hair started freaking out. The other disciple told him to calm down, but he just shouted, asking if he was really being told to calm down at a time like this. He realized that the Tai Hua Pavilion was originally owned by the Manhwa Sect. At the same time, his fist clenched tightly, shaking with anger. One of the disciples asked if the pavilion owner Kong was really trying to take the temple after lending them money. Another disciple confirmed that it was true, which made the situation even worse. But something didn't feel right. A strange feeling washed over him. The disciple with red hair said it was weird that the Tai Hua Pavilion, which used to belong to Manhwa Sect, was now lending them money. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The disciple with black hair realized that if something didn't add up, it probably meant things were going in the wrong direction. He felt a shiver run down his spine. Jo-gul looked shocked as someone called him. He stammered, trying to sound respectful. "Sahyong Jo-gul. Yes, sir? Yeah?" The voice ordered him to bring the thing he had mentioned before. Jo-gul looked confused, wondering what he was talking about. The speaker repeated himself, making it clear he wasn't messing around, and immediately, Jo-gul realized what he meant and shouted back, "That thing. Oh, that thing. I'll bring it right away." Jo-gul returned, holding a large bundle wrapped in cloth. He looked up, asking what they were going to do with it. The speaker began to explain. There's an old saying in Buddhist literature. As he spoke, Jo-gul and another disciple looked on, wondering what he was getting at. Chung Myung, dressed in strange clothes, started explaining the meaning behind a dark saying. He said that killing a Buddha or your forefather doesn't mean literally killing them. It means you have to abandon any attachments that get in your way, no matter what they are. Chung Myung continued, saying that if you meet a Buddha, kill him. He explained that to truly achieve the way of the Tao, you have to violate the way of the Tao. It was a strange lesson, to say the least. Chung Myung suddenly announced that he was off to find the true way of the Tao. Below him, two disciples looked up, completely shocked. One of them shouted, asking where he thought he was going, dressed up like that, calling him a dumbass. The disciple yelled, asking if he was thinking of leaving the Sect temple. He called Chung Myung a crazy bastard, and told him to jump, and without a second thought, Chung Myung jumped right off the wall. Chung Myung stood on a hill overlooking the Mount Hua Sect. The lights of the temple twinkled in the distance, but he didn't look back. He was gone, off to find the true way of the Tao, whatever that meant. Laughter echoed from the Tai Hua Pavilion, bouncing off the walls. It was a cruel sound, mocking the Mount Hua Sect. The sect leader looked completely shocked, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. They had basically given Mount Hua a final warning. The man laughed, asking how much the Mount Hua Sect thought they had borrowed. It was over 100,000 niang. He found the whole thing hilarious. The man said that the sect leader was even more bewildered because pavilion owner Kong was with them. He asked if that wasn't right. The merchant said that although he seeks profit, he felt sorry for having to do this to them. He said that after all, they had been in a good relationship for many generations. Taehua, pavilion owner Kong, said that they did the best they could. He asked how many times he had already let it slide. Taehua, pavilion owner Kong, said that everyone would praise his generosity. He said that he really hoped that was the case, laughing. Taehua, pavilion owner Kong, said that they were so carefree. He couldn't believe that they were able to live as such simpletons. Taehua, pavilion owner Kong, said that the power of the Mount Hua Sect was not something to be looked down on. The man said that the true strength of the Mount Hua Sect did not lie in their combat power. He warned that the biggest thing about the Mount Hua Sect to be wary of was their history. The guy was eating duck, and he was saying that in the Shanxi province, it'd be hard to find someone without any connection to the Mount Hua Sect. However, he took another bite, and he continued that these days, the Mount Hua Sect was significantly weaker. The guy then said that the Mount Hua Sect had become tender, just like the duck he was eating, whose skin ripped apart even with minimal force from the chopsticks. Pavilion owner Kong turned to the other guy and asked what he was thinking of doing with the temple after he took it from the Manhwa sect. He figured it'd be hard to sell, so the other man suggested that they just take something else from them instead. Pavilion owner Kong, sitting at the table, explained that the true value of their temple was beyond anything they could imagine. He seemed to know something the others didn't, and he was enjoying holding that knowledge over them. Kong continued, assuring them that even though the temple looked like nothing special, he could guarantee its true value. He let out a short laugh, then asked the other man what he meant by his earlier comment. He was playing games, clearly. Up close, Kong bit down on his chopsticks, looking annoyed. He thought to himself, damn idiots. And then he told the others that he couldn't tell them directly. Kong explained that they could use the Manhwa sect's enemies to their advantage. He asked how many other sects would be willing to spend a fortune to buy the temple, just to erase the Manhwa sect from existence. It was a dark plan, but effective. Kong finished by telling everyone not to worry. He promised that he would make sure they all got their money's worth. The others seemed satisfied with his explanation, but the whole thing felt pretty messed up. The others were really eating up what Kong was selling. One of them even slammed his cup on the table and said that Kong was a very smart man. Kong poured drinks for everyone. He told them to raise their glasses for pavilion owner Kong. Everyone raised their glasses. They all shouted, "Cheers!" together. Hours later, under the cover of night, a man walked away from the building, humming to himself. He thought this felt great. He figured if he managed to get the money back from the Manhwa sect, it would be enough to last him his entire life. He also knew that pavilion owner Kong was very thorough when it came to money. The man felt great, and the moon was so bright. But then he paused, realizing there was no moon at all. He figured it must be a new moon. He figured he should probably walk through the main streets on nights like this. He was really enjoying himself. Meanwhile, the man's drunken stroll was about to be interrupted. He started sweating, not feeling so good anymore. Below, shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, their intentions unclear. He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his gut. Suddenly, a figure in black appeared, standing silently in the night. He was completely covered, like a ninja from the stories. Suddenly, a voice called out, stopping him in his tracks. The figure in black looked up, startled by the sudden shout. The man stared at the burglar, completely thrown off by his outfit. He thought the guy looked like he'd walked straight out of a drawing, and he was also way too small. The man wondered if burglars usually wore such obvious clothes. He thought it was annoying that they were basically advertising their job to the entire world. Below, he asked the burglar if that was actually what he was. The burglar looked up, listening carefully. He said he wasn't interested in money. He just needed some answers, and he'd let him go unharmed. The man looked back at the burglar, a bit annoyed. He said it wasn't like he wanted to answer, but he didn't really have a choice. The burglar smirked, letting the man know that he had quite a few friends with him, you see. He seemed pretty confident, like he had everything under control. He went on to say that they didn't even let him walk around alone. Turns out, a whole group of men were standing behind him, all wearing similar hats and dark clothes. Someone watching nearby figured they must be high-class bodyguards. The guy's eyes were sharp, like he was ready to jump into action at any moment. One of the men wondered what they should do. He even suggested killing him, but another guy in the group thought they should at least hear him out and then capture him, making sure he could still talk. The burglar spoke up again, saying he wasn't a fan of violent scenes. At that moment, I was wondering what he was planning, since he was the one who broke in here in the first place. The man in green robes looked around, reacting to the sound he had just heard. He mumbled, "That's right." He suddenly yelled out, letting everyone know that the last hit seemed a bit too much. As a result, the face of one of the attackers was shown. The man in green robes stood over the burglar, looking down at him. He questioned if the others were listening when he told them to make sure the guy could at least talk. The man looked surprised, as if he hadn't realized the burglar was in such bad shape. He asked, "Oh, is that so?" The ninja stood over the bodies of the men who had attacked the Manhwa sect. It was a brutal scene, with bodies scattered everywhere. The man in green robes thought that people really needed to understand what others said to them, but there were some who just refused to do so, and immediately, the burglar was shown on the ground, beaten. The man in green robes called the burglar over, telling him to come closer. He was clearly setting a trap. The man in green robes repeated that if the burglar answered his questions, he would let him go unharmed. The burglar was scared and agreed. The burglar was caught off guard and shouted, asking what the hell was going on. He didn't expect to be attacked after agreeing to answer the questions. The man in green robes explained that if the burglar had just answered his questions when he first asked, he would have let him go unharmed. But since he tried to fight, this was what he deserved. The man in black clothes loomed over the burglar, who was still on the ground. He promised that he'd make sure the guy could at least talk. The burglar burglar tried to speak, but his face was so swollen he couldn't get the words out right. It came out as a slurred mess. The ninja warned him to fix his pronunciation before he hit him again, clearly not in the mood for games. The burglar, terrified, promised to speak clearly. The ninja asked if he was saying that he had loaned more than 100,000 yangs to the Manhwa sect. The burglar confirmed that was right. The ninja sighed, clearly not buying it. The burglar, seeing his reaction, looked even more scared and nervous. The ninja pointed out that even if he sold everything the burglar had, right down to his underwear, there was no way he'd make 10,000 yangs, let alone 100,000. The ninja wanted to know if he was claiming to have loaned 100,000 yangs to the Manhwa sect, which was supposedly collapsing. Trying to save his skin, the burglar stammered that he could explain everything. The burglar explained that it was just how high interest rates worked. He said if you loan money with a high interest rate, as long as they didn't pay it off, the interest just kept getting higher. The burglar continued that if you just gave it a little time, the interest became way higher than the original loan. Meanwhile, the ninja was trembling, barely able to contain his fury. The ninja struck the burglar hard, sending him flying. He shouted that taking money that way wasn't something to be proud of. The burglar coughed, blood splattering on the ground. He managed to choke out that he was also the owner of the fabric shop. He barely whispered, "Yes, sir." The ninja pressed the burglar, wanting to know when he had bought the fabric shop. The burglar stammered, pretending he didn't understand the question. The burglar insisted that his family had owned the fabric shop for generations, but the ninja didn't buy it, declaring that there was no way that was the case. The ninja explained that the fabric shop was one of the businesses of the Manhwa sect. He added that all the best businesses in the prefecture originally belonged to them, and that the development of the whole area was all due to the sect. The ninja continued that they had left the actual management to stand-in representatives, but those scumbags must have taken the opportunity to take over the businesses while the Manhwa sect was collapsing. The burglar interrupted, asking why he was being hit. The ninja looked absolutely furious. He yelled that the burglar was a scoundrel and prepared to strike him again. The ninja stood firmly, ready to fight. He couldn't believe he had been caught off guard like that. The burglar was furious. Judging from his skills, he doubted the ninja was just some nobody, so he demanded that he identify himself. At that moment, Jung Bin declared that he was the escort warrior, Jung Bin. He was sure the burglar must have heard of him. The ninja paused, tilting his head. He apologized, saying he wasn't really knowledgeable in those kinds of things, but he asked why Jung Bin wanted to know his identity. Jung Bin explained that he should at least know the identity of those who would die by his blade. He asked if the ninja didn't remember getting knocked out after he hit him just a few moments ago. Jung Bin was absolutely furious, calling the ninja an arrogant scumbag, and immediately he grabbed his sword, ready to attack. Jung Bin charged forward, ready to strike. He yelled at the ninja to brace himself. Jung Bin was confident, announcing himself as the escort warrior, Jung Bin. He was sure the ninja would soon fall before him. The ninja looked down, thinking that Jung Bin was definitely stronger than him in terms of pure strength. His inner strength, physical strength, and speed were incomparable to Jung Bin's. But despite that, the ninja didn't believe that made him weaker than Jung Bin. The ninja knew that pure strength and speed didn't define how strong one was in a fight. He was ready to use his skills to win. The ninja suddenly threw a bunch of swords into the air. They spun around like crazy, reflecting the light. The ninja and Jung Bin clashed, their swords meeting with a loud clang. The force of their blows sent shockwaves through the air. Jung Bin suddenly looked very confused. He clearly didn't understand what was happening. The ninja thought that he had the advantage because of his experience. After all, he still had his memories from when he was the Plum Blossom Sword Saint. The ninja realized that if he lacked pure strength, he just needed to borrow it from his opponent. He was ready to turn Jung Bin's power against him. The ninja kicked Jung Bin hard, sending him flying backwards, and immediately after, the ninja gripped his sword tightly, preparing for another strike. The ninja's eyes narrowed, focused, and deadly. On the other hand, Jung Bin lay on the ground, dazed and defeated. The ninja didn't even look at Jung Bin. He just told him to come back after training more. The ninja sheathed his sword, the blade sliding smoothly into its place. He was already preparing to leave. The sword clattered against the hard ground. The sound echoed in the silent space. The ninja looked down at Jung Bin, who was still lying on the ground. He suddenly realized that he needed to know something from him, but he almost forgot what it was. The ninja thought he had almost forgotten about Jung Bin. He suddenly remembered that he had accidentally revealed his sword techniques to the guy. The ninja wondered if Jung Bin had figured out who he was. He recalled that he even drew the plum blossom flower buds, so Jung Bin must have figured it out, right? The ninja realized realized that Jungbin had a polished and beautiful sword technique and a high level of martial arts. But most of all, Jungbin could faintly sense the pure chi emitting from him. The ninja thought that this was really bad. The injured man, his face swollen and bruised, asked if the ninja was from the Southern Edge sect. Huh? He mumbled, barely able to speak through the pain. The ninja stood among the fallen bodies, the silence broken only by the wind. It was a grim reminder of the deadly efficiency he possessed. The ninja's eyes widened as he realized the injured man might have figured out his identity. And immediately, the injured man exclaimed, "That's right! Chung Myung, level 15, Southern Edge sect! I knew it." The injured man, desperate to save himself, offered to answer any questions the ninja had. "Please, ask me anything. I will answer everything to the best of my abilities." Yeah, alright, thanks, I guess. The building loomed above, casting a long shadow over the scene. Something felt off, like a storm was brewing. Joe Ghoul was getting anxious, tapping his foot impatiently. "What's taking him so long?" he asked, clearly worried. But Sa-young tried to calm him down, telling him to just relax. Joe Ghoul was still worried, but Sa-young tried to reassure him. "But Sa-young," Joe Ghoul protested. But Sa-young insisted that he knew Chung Myung wasn't an idiot and could handle himself. Sa-young looked at Joe Ghoul with confidence. He said that Chung Myung would be back, sooner or later, so there was no need to worry. Sa-young's face turned to worry. He muttered that as long as Chung Myung didn't get into an accident, everything would be fine. The door creaked open, breaking the silence. It sounded like someone had just arrived, but who was it? The door swung open with a bang, and Chung Myung walked in, looking around. "Did anything happen while I was out?" he asked, his voice loud. "Sajay!" He didn't wait for an answer, but walked right in. The door creaked open wider as someone else entered the room. Yoon Jong and Joe Ghoul turned to look at Chung Myung, a little surprised. "That's something we should be asking you," Yoon Jong said, sounding calm. "Did anything important happen outside?" Joe Ghoul added that not much had happened. Chung Myung smirked, holding up his hand to show off a few coins. "I was treated very well," he said, sounding pleased with himself. "And I even got some spare change on top of that." Suddenly, a man with puffed up cheeks and a suspicious look on his face spoke up. "Are you from the Southern Edge sect?" he asked, his voice full of doubt. "Huh?" Chung Myung thought it was probably a good thing that the guy couldn't figure out who he was. Still, it left a bitter taste in his mouth. The plum blossom sword techniques were lost, so it wasn't the symbol of the Manhwa sect anymore. Even so, Chung Myung thought that Jongsan Yu, who had lived his entire life in the Hwa-Um prefecture, couldn't think of the Manhwa sect after seeing his sword technique. Joe Ghoul asked Chung Myung what he had been doing outside of the temple. Chung Myung said it wasn't something a child like him should know about. Joe Ghoul pointed out that Chung Myung was also a child. Chung Myung brushed it off and told him to gather everyone, because they needed to train now. Joe Ghoul looked surprised and asked if they were really going to train again, since they had just gotten back. He seemed tired already. Chung Myung, looking serious, told Sa-young to listen up carefully. He was about to make a big announcement. Chung Myung declared that, starting that day, they wouldn't miss a single day of training, no matter what. He shouted that even if the Manhwa sect fell, they wouldn't take a single day off. Joe Ghoul, all fired up, said he was ready for this and would gather everyone right away. But then Chung Myung casually said he wouldn't be participating that day because he had something else to do. Sajay pointed out that the training session was only possible when Chung Myung was there. It seemed like they relied on him way more than he let on. Joe Ghoul pointed out that they could train on their own that day, but he also mentioned that if they really wanted the other disciples to try hard, Chung Myung needed to show up too. He added they should just look at his face to see how tired he was. Then Yoon Jong said they were heading out. Joe Ghoul agreed and waved goodbye, saying they'd see him later. Chung Myung was now alone. He flopped onto the bed with a clearly exhausted. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling. Then he started thinking about what he should do next, since the situation was, he remembered that the stand-in representatives had taken over the businesses. It looked like they were settling in. The account books that could have proven Manhwa sect's ownership of the businesses had been burned down by the Heavenly Demon Sect members, along with Manhwa itself. After all, there was no way any of this would have happened if the account books were still around. Chung Myung wondered if he should just assault them and wipe out all the merchants. He imagined himself doing it, cutting down the merchants in a rage. Chung Myung was lying down, thinking about the situation. He decided he shouldn't give in to violence, because everyone would think the Manhwa sect pushed a small child into wrongdoing, so he just needed an excuse. He needed an excuse for the Manhwa sect to not pay back the merchants options, and he needed evidence to prove that the businesses were originally owned by the Manhwa sect. But the problem was that Chung Myung didn't know where to find the excuses and evidence. He lay there, frustrated by the lack of options. Chung Myung was still lying there, lost in thought. The silence was only broken by the sound of his own breathing. Then it hit him. He suddenly remembered the account book. Come to think of it, he thought, I remember seeing Sahyung Jang-moon write in it a few times. He then remembered that whenever he came in, Jang-moon would hide a few volumes of the account books they had. The guy was always acting sneaky. He paused, his eyes widening. He was onto something. He could feel it. He sat up, his mind racing. Were there only a few volumes of those books? He suddenly had a bad feeling about this. Chung Myung's eyes went wide. He realized that Jang-moon must have hidden the rest of the account books somewhere else. There was no way that Manhwa sect only had a few volumes of account books when they managed so many businesses. The secret storage, which only the sect leader could enter, that's where the account books must be. Sahyung must have put them there. He'd heard a few rumors about it before. If there really was a secret storage, then its entrance was most likely inside the sect leader's residence. Chung Myung needed to think. The sect leader's residence hadn't changed from the past. It was somewhere in Manhwa, where many martial art masters resided, and was hidden somewhere close to the sect leader's residence. Chung Myung stared intently at the hills behind the sect leader's residence. That had to be it. He figured the storage must be underground. If they built it under the hills, there was no way anyone could ever figure out where it was. Chung Myung smiled, ready to start some unprecedented treasure hunting. He was gonna find those books, no matter what. He quietly slid open a window, slipping into the sect leader's residence. He had to be sneaky about this. Chung Myung jumped from the building, already apologizing to Sahyung Jang-moon in his head. After all, saving the Manhwa sect had to be his first priority, right? The ninja thought to himself that he'd hand it over to the sect leader without getting his hands on it, if he could. And immediately, he started running across the roof, heading towards his target. Meanwhile, Chung Myung was running with a stick over his shoulder, a huge smile on his face. He was gonna find those books, no matter what it took. Chung Myung thought to himself that he'd hand it over to the sect leader without getting his hands on it, if possible, that is. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist. The air was still, and the silence was broken only by the wind whistling through the rocks. Suddenly, Chung Myung lost his footing and started falling backwards. He shouted that he was gonna die. Chung Myung sat at the bottom of the small hill, catching his breath. He muttered to himself that it might be a small hill, but it was still the same as searching an entire mountain, which was no easy task. Chung Myung looked annoyed. Even when he did it this way, it was still a pain. Chung Myung sat down and put his hands together, focusing his energy, and immediately, a blue light started glowing from his hands, swirling with power. Chung Myung focused, his hands glowing with a bright blue light. He channeled his energy, hoping this would lead him to the hidden storage room. Chung Myung watched as the beam shot out from his hands, piercing through the ground. He thought that if the energy met a large, empty space, that would be the storage room. Chung Myung stared at the ground, a question mark hanging in the air. He said that was what he thought, and he didn't know where it was, but there was no other reason for the empty space to be in the ground there. Chung Myung fell back, exhausted and frustrated. He exclaimed that he was gonna die, and it was probably not there. Chung Myung looked up, his eyes filled with determination. He decided to screw it and try one more time. Chung Myung gasped for air, his lungs burning. He wasn't gonna give up just yet. He had to try one more time. Chung Myung focused his energy again, sending a beam of light into the ground. But as the light pulsed, Chung Myung looked confused, not understanding what was happening. The beam of energy shot down into the earth, creating a ripple effect. And immediately, Chung Myung realized what it meant. He had found it. Chung Myung shouted that he had found it. And immediately, he grabbed a pickaxe, ready to dig into the ground. Chung Myung knew he needed to dig to confirm what he had found with his own eyes. With a grunt, he swung the pickaxe down, the sound echoing in the room. Chung Myung stared at the ground, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel that he was close to finding what he'd been searching for. Chung Myung looked absolutely shocked. Bricks? He wondered if this was really Manhwa's secret storage. There was no way it could be made out of just bricks, not with all of Manhwa's treasures and account books supposedly hidden inside. He reached out and touched the bricks, feeling around the edges, and immediately, his eyes widened as he looked into the hole he had created. A grin spread spreading across his face, saying it was nice. A dark hallway stretched out before him, promising secrets and hidden treasures. Chung Myung shouted that he found the hallway that led to the secret storage. Chung Myung stared down the hallway, a mix of excitement and nervousness swirling within him. He wondered what secrets and dangers awaited him in the depths of the secret storage. Chung Myung stood in the hallway, deep in thought. He wondered if the sect leader knew about the hidden safe. If he did, that could complicate things. Chung Myung walked further down the hallway and reached out to touch the wall. He ran his fingers along the cold, rough surface, searching for any sign of a hidden door or mechanism. Chung Myung's eyes landed on a door at the end of the hallway. He wondered if the scratch door was the entrance to the secret storage. It definitely looked like it had been through a lot. Chung Myung approached the door cautiously, his hand hovering over the surface. But what was he doing? He couldn't figure it out. Chung Myung stared at the door for a long moment. Then it hit him. He wasn't trying to do anything. He was just standing there, observing. Chung Myung stared at the door, thinking about the sect leader. He knew that the sect leader was just a man who couldn't do anything as Manhwa fell apart. The study of martial arts was declining, and the wealth of the sect was decreasing. Leading Manhwa in a situation like this had to be a depressing task for the sect leader. How would it feel to watch Manhwa, the place you've spent your entire life protecting, fall apart without being able to do anything to stop it? Chung Myung wondered about that, but the sect leader couldn't tell anyone about that feeling. He had to keep it all inside, hidden from everyone else, because the sect leader is someone the disciples can lean on, and therefore, he had to hide his own pain and be strong for them. He was a man who endured the pain and sadness all alone in places like this, far from the eyes of his disciples. He carried the weight of Manhwa on his shoulders, a burden he couldn't share with anyone. The sound of crumbling stone echoed through the chamber. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the debris as he walked towards the hole in the wall. He stood in the hallway, his expression unreadable. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint sound of his own breathing. Chung Myung stood there, his hand resting against the cold stone wall. He realized that he was at fault for what had happened to Manhwa. He looked up, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. It wasn't too late to fix things. He could still save Manhwa. Chung Myung stood before the massive door, ready to get it open. He muttered that he was going to swing the damn thing open first. He pressed his hand against the cold, hard wood of the door. The silence was heavy, filled with anticipation. Chung Myung began to channel his energy, a faint blue glow surrounding his hand. He focused all of his power into the ancient door, hoping it would respond. The energy surged around him, crackling with raw power. The air vibrated as he unleashed the full force of his technique, but the energy just bounced right off the door, leaving Chung Myung completely shocked. He wondered what the hell was going on. Chung Myung stared at the door in disbelief. He realized it was made of the everlasting metal, and it was at least a foot thick. He thought that the secret storage would be made out of the strongest metal in the world, said to be even more expensive than gold. Chung Myung knew that something this size would take the strongest master in the world to barely cut through it. That's why the sect leader didn't even try to open it, he figured. The problem was, even Chung Myung couldn't open this. He was starting to feel like he was in over his head. Chung Myung looked around the room, trying to figure out another way to get through the door. He was determined to find a solution, no matter how difficult it seemed. If only he could find that way. Then, Chung Myung noticed something on the wall. He wondered what it was. Chung Myung carefully examined the pattern on the wall. He wondered what it could be. Then it hit him. Chung Myung realized that the patterns weren't just decorations. They were blade marks. Chung Myung stared intently. Some of the marks resembled the movement plum blossom sword technique. He was starting to piece things together. He looked closer. This one was the bamboo leaf sword technique, and that one was the equilibrium sword technique. Now that he knew they were blade marks, Chung Myung started to recognize them for what they were. Chung Myung's eyes widened. If these were the clues on how to open the door, he was finally on the right track. Chung Myung realized what he was dealing with. Turns out, it was the Violet Dawn fortified chi. Chung Myung planned it out. He'd follow the marks precisely, starting with the equilibrium sword technique and the bamboo leaf sword technique. Then he'd move on to the 24 movement plum blossom sword technique, and finally bring out the plum blossom sword dance. That's how he'd open the door. He wondered how anyone could make something like this. Anyway, Chung Myung felt like he got the gist of it. He could see the complex patterns of the door right in front of him. That meant there was just one problem left. Chung Myung wondered how he was supposed to perform all those techniques. It would have been no problem if it was his past self. However, now Chung Myung was nothing but a child. He could play it all in his head, but applying inner strength to his blade and instantly performing those techniques was currently impossible for him. Chung Myung realized there was still a way, but he really didn't want to do it. He could already feel the exhaustion creeping in. He focused his energy. His hands started to glow with a bright, unnatural light as he started to gather his innate, true chi. Chung Myung figured he'd just take a break for about a month, maybe longer. He knew this would take a lot out of him. He told himself he'd only use a little bit of it, just a little bit of his innate true chi. He really hoped that would be enough. Chung Myung released the energy. A bright light surrounded his body as he started to perform the sword techniques. The innate true chi. It's something everyone has since they're born. It's the energy that keeps you alive. Basically, it's a life force. Chung Myung knew that if he used it, he'd have to brace himself for the consequences, but he didn't have a choice right now. Chung Myung was surrounded by a bright purple light as he performed the sword techniques. He had to focus all of his energy. The sword glowed with an unnatural light as Chung Myung poured his energy into it, but at the same time, he spat out blood, feeling the strain on his body. Chung Myung wasn't sure if it was even possible, but he told himself it had to be. He figured his body was just acting weird because it wasn't used to stuff like this. He stomped down hard, knowing there was no turning back now. Chung Myung declared that there were no second chances. He swung the sword with all his might, the blade cutting through the air. The purple aura of innate true chi swirled around him as he focused on the task at hand. Blood trickled from Chung Myung's mouth as he pushed his body to its absolute limit. At the same time, his hand trembled as he gripped the sword, feeling the immense strain on his muscles. He refused to give in, clenching his fist so hard that his knuckles turned white. Chung Myung knew he was close, and he wouldn't let his body betray him now. Chung Myung took another step forward, ignoring the pain and exhaustion. He wouldn't stop, no matter what it took. The sword moved so fast, it was almost impossible to see. The blade danced between the equilibrium sword technique and the bamboo leaf sword technique. He didn't stop there. From the bamboo leaf sword technique, he transitioned into the movement plum blossom sword technique. Not a single pause. Chung Myung's face was a mask of concentration as he channeled his energy. The air crackled around him, the intensity building with each movement. He roared, declaring that he was the plum blossom sword saint. The words echoed through the room, filled with power. With a final surge of energy, Chung Myung completed the sequence. The sword moved in a blur, cutting through the air with incredible force. Chung Myung coughed, spitting out blood. He had pushed himself too hard, and his body was starting to feel the strain. He collapsed to the ground, panting. The residual energy from the sword technique swirled around him, a chaotic reminder of the power he had just unleashed. Blood stained the floor, each drop a testament to the effort he had put into that final strike. It was a grim reminder of what it took to unlock this secret. Chung Myung pushed himself up, his face pale and streaked with blood. Did it work? He asked, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and anticipation. He stared at the door, his heart pounding. It would be devastating if it still wasn't opened after all that, he thought to himself. The power of the sword technique began to condense, swirling into a vortex of pure energy. It was a dangerous amount of power to contain in such a small space. The energy exploded outwards, shaking the entire room, and immediately, Chung Myung was left staring blankly, totally confused by what was happening. Chung Myung's eyes widened in shock. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, his face frozen in disbelief. The sound of stone grinding against stone echoed through the chamber as the door began to crack open. Chung Myung looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. The door swung open, revealing the hidden chamber beyond. Chung Myung grinned, finally able to see the results of his efforts. It opened, he thought. Chung Myung's face was all puffed up as he tried to cough. He could feel blood trickling down his face, a grim reminder of the power he had just unleashed. The floor was now covered in blood, splattered everywhere from the force of the blast. It was a messy scene, to say the least. Chung Myung coughed again, more blood coming up. He was clearly in a lot of pain, his body taking a beating from using all that power. Chung Myung sat there on the floor, beat. He figured he'd be stuck in bed for at least 2 months now, not just one. Saving the Manhwa Sect was such a pain in the butt, he thought. He slowly got to his feet, ignoring the pain, and as he stood up, Chung Myung gripped his sword tightly, ready to face whatever was next. Chung Myung wiped the blood from his mouth. His eyes narrowed with determination. He wasn't about to let a little pain stop him from getting to the bottom of this. Chung Myung glanced down, a glint of curiosity in his eyes. He wondered what kind of secrets Seung Jongmun had been hiding all this time. Shall I take a look at what Seung Jongmun's been hiding? He thought. Chung Myung didn't hesitate. He gathered all his power and slammed it into the door, the force causing cracks to appear all around it. The entire structure shook as he forced it open. Chung Myung stepped into the room. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just left behind. Chung Myung looked around, but there were only 3 bookshelves. It's smaller than I thought, he muttered, clearly disappointed. Chung Myung figured it made sense, though. He thought that making a huge safe out of everlasting metal would only be possible for the greatest sect in the world. Chung Myung remembered how Sa-young kept complaining about how they had no money. He guessed Sa-young had used all of it to make this storage room. Chung Myung reached out and grabbed a book, his eyes widening in surprise. What the hell was this? Chung Myung's eyes lit up as he held the books. He shouted that he had found them, the account books of the Manhwa sect. The pages were filled with meticulous records. It looked like Sa-young had even made copies of the originals from the Finance and Economy Agency. Such a thorough man. This would definitely do. Chung Myung pumped his fist, declaring that the damn merchants were all doomed now. But now that he thought about it, Chung Myung squinted, looking at the shelves. He wondered if there were really only papers in here. Chung Myung began rummaging through the bookshelves, clearly looking for something else. He complained that if Sa-young had hidden away some money, he could have used it for the greater good. He grumbled that aside from returning prosperity to the Manhwa sect, he would have eaten meat and drunk alcohol to his heart's content. He was disappointed that the nasty old man really did not hide any money here. Chung Myung sighed, wondering what he had even expected from Sa-young. He figured he would just look through the papers, wondering what the old man had put on the second shelf. Chung Myung's eyes widened as he found a secret technique book. He wondered if it had been used before. He paused, taking a closer look. Chung Myung realized that these techniques hadn't been used before. These were martial arts technique books that had been practically abandoned by the Manhwa sect. Chung Myung thought about Sa-young Jang-moon. He figured the old man probably couldn't bring himself to completely abandon the martial arts techniques they decided not to pass on to future generations. He must have stored them in here because he thought throwing them away might negatively impact the Manhwa sect in the future. Chung Myung thought. Sa-young really couldn't let go of the past. The first bookshelf signified the duties of the Manhwa sect leader. The second shelf must signify the sect leader's personal attachments and affections to the Manhwa sect. Chung Myung grabbed a book tightly. He promised Sa-young that he would make sure to bring the Manhwa sect back to its place. Not only that, Chung Myung thought, he'd even make it stronger than it ever was. He looked absolutely determined to do it. Chung Myung turned to the third bookshelf, looking to see what was on it. He was searching for something. Chung Myung asked if the scroll was the only thing on the third bookshelf. It seemed pretty empty. He unfolded the letter carefully, his heart pounding with anticipation. The old paper crackled softly as he began to read the words written long ago. Chung Myung looked up, surprised. The letter was from the sect leader. He continued reading, his eyes scanning the ancient script. If anyone was reading this right now, it meant the next generation sect leader had been decided. He turned the page, his expression thoughtful. The sect leader humbly left his words in this letter. The role of the Manhwa sect leader wasn't simply to lead the Manhwa sect. If the reader was already a sect leader, they surely must know this already. The letter went on to say that those who truly lead the Manhwa sect are none other than its own disciples, the children who would grow to carry its legacy. He could almost see the sect leader carefully writing these words, each stroke filled with the weight of responsibility. The sect leader continued, saying that the job of anyone leading the sect was simply to protect and motivate the disciples. They needed to ensure everyone could chase their dreams, nothing less. The letter stated that the Manhwa sect was just the Manhwa sect. It was full of a will and spirit that no one could ever control or lead. Whether it was on the rise or in decline, the Manhwa sect would always be itself, the letter said. It was a promise and a warning all in one. The sect leader's final words were about ensuring the will of the Manhwa sect was passed on to future generations, unchanged. The key to that was fostering those future generations and continuing their legacy. The letter spoke of a great responsibility left behind by the writer, a duty passed down from ancestor to successor. The letter identified the writer as Chung Mun, the 21st sect leader of the great Manhwa sect. Chung Myung continued to read, feeling the weight of those words. He muttered that the guy seemed to like nagging others, even from beyond the grave. Yu Iseol stood near the doorway, quietly observing him. She figured she didn't get much out of this trip, but it should be enough. What really mattered was that she finally had the account books in her hands. She started walking back the way she came. Chung Myung thought that with these, he could bring back Manhwa's stolen businesses. But then he paused. Something didn't feel right to him. Chung Myung looked around the storage room, his eyes narrowing. Something was definitely off about the way this place looked. He stared around, his face showing his confusion. This was strange, really strange. Chung Myung remembered that the Sahyung Chung Moon he knew had terrible OCD. He was someone who kept 2 lamps in his room, directly on his right and left, to keep the symmetry of his room. Chung Myung looked at the 3rd shelf, now almost empty. He wondered how someone like Chung Moon could have left it like this. Chung Myung stared up at the shelf, his eyes widening. Suddenly, a hand reached out and pushed the shelf hard. Chung Myung gritted his teeth and shoved against the shelf, putting his weight into it. There definitely is something special about this shelf. The shelf groaned under the force, wood splintering. Chung Myung finally managed to shove the shelf aside, revealing a hidden room behind it. Dust billowed out as he stepped inside. Chung Myung knew he was right about this door, and immediately, he saw that there was something inside. The room glowed with a golden light, like something out of a fairy tale, and Chung Myung finally got inside. He ended up witnessing something incredible. Piles and piles of golden bars. It was insane. And there were the swords, the most precious swords, all perfectly organized and lined up. There were also gems and secret technique books piled everywhere. Chung Myung spotted a cat's eye stone and couldn't believe his luck. Chung Myung started laughing like a total maniac. He was enjoying every second of this. He shouted that he was finally rich. He was going to make sure to bring the Manhwa sect back to its former glory. It was morning already. Someone noticed the sun coming up. It must have been the start of a delightful day for some people, but Hyunjong couldn't help but resent it. He was staring out at the rising sun, but couldn't bring himself to feel any joy. There were only 5 days remaining until the promised appointment with the pavilion owner Kong. Hyunjong knew that if he failed, the Manhwa sect would be done for. Suddenly, someone yelled out, calling for the sect leader. The shout echoed through the halls, filled with panic. Hyunjong asked Eungum what was going on, but Eungum was so nervous that he could barely get the words out. Eungum said that he would tell him all the details once they got there. He insisted that the sect leader had to go see it for himself right away. It was that important. Hyunjong looked confused and asked where he had to go. He didn't understand why he was being rushed like this. Hyunjong figured that it must be something really important if Eungum was acting this desperate. He told him to lead the way, deciding to trust his judgment. Eungum agreed immediately. They rushed through the forest, pushing past the trees. The wind whistled in their ears as they moved faster and faster. Hyunjong suddenly stopped and looked down the hill. As a result, his eyes went wide with disbelief at the sight below. Hyunjong rushed forward, seeing all the disciples lying on the ground, knocked out. He asked Eungum what the hell had happened to the kids. He recalled they were just doing some extra training this morning. The sound of footsteps echoed through the forest. They were getting closer to their destination, and fast. We're almost there. The sect leader could sense something was wrong. He yelled out, demanding to know where Chung Myung was. Below, the sect leader's face was full of panic. Hyunjong kept shouting, desperate to find the kid. Where are you, Chung Myung? Chung Myung looked back at them, his voice calm. He simply said, I am here. Hyunjong was completely stunned. He started to ask why Chung Myung was standing there, looking worn out. The sect leader demanded to know what the hell had happened to him. Chung Myung insisted that the sect leader take a look at something first, saying it was very important. But Hyunjong wouldn't hear of it, saying that Chung Myung's condition seemed more important. Hyunjong looked at Chung Myung with concern, but his curiosity was getting the better of him. He wondered what could possibly be of such importance. Suddenly, the entire area was filled with a blinding light. The sect leader squinted, trying to figure out what was going on. Hyunjong's eyes widened in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was seeing in front of him. Chung Myung looked back, a wide smile spreading across his face. He couldn't believe what he had just stumbled upon. A treasure chest overflowed with gold bars and ancient books. Chung Myung realized he had discovered this by accident. Hyunjong was absolutely shocked. He stammered, asking how Chung Myung had found this place. He was sweating from exhaustion. Hyunjong quickly told Chung Myung to go back and rest, saying he wouldn't ask any more questions. Chung Myung's shoulders slumped as he tried to catch his breath. He was completely drained. The shiny golden bars seemed to stretch on forever. Chung Myung stared in awe, completely speechless. Hyunjong's eyes widened as he looked at the contents of the chest. He muttered, realizing realizing there was something even more important inside. Lying inside the chest were the account books. Hyunjong realized they were the Hua Prefecture business account books of the great Manhwa sect. Hyunjong slapped his forehead, suddenly understanding the situation. He had almost forgotten about these books. Hyunjong knew that if he carelessly opened the books, they might crumble apart, and he'd be uneasy for the rest of his life. On top of that, there was something else that caught his attention. Hyunjong carefully picked up one of the books. He stammered in disbelief, barely able to comprehend what he was seeing. Hyunjong's eyes went wide as he read the words in the book. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The shock of what he was reading was too much for Hyunjong. He fell backwards, overwhelmed. 2 members of the sect saw Hyunjong fall. They ran towards him immediately, shouting for their sect leader. Hyunjong looked up, dazed. He mumbled something unintelligible. Hyunjong finally managed to get the words out. He announced that these were the 7 Plum Blossoms Sword Technique records. Hyunjong suddenly sat up in his bed. He looked around, clearly disturbed by something. Someone shouted, asking if they had brought the chest with them. He was relieved that the sect leader was awake, and immediately demanded that Hyunyoung, the leader of the Finance and Economy Agency, be brought to Hyunjong. The person stared intently at the book. He seemed shocked by what he was reading. Hyunyoung declared that they were all real, confirming the authenticity of the items. Hyunjong asked if he was sure. The other man confirmed that he was completely sure. He added that he had also secured the verification documents that were under the treasures. Hyunyoung held up the documents, explaining that they were from the government itself. He said that with these, they could not only prove that the account books were real, but also, Hyunyoung continued, saying that they could immediately bring back the businesses of the Taihua Pavilion and the Hua Prefecture, which had originally been under the Manhwa sect. He added that the treasures that came with these documents easily exceeded 100,000 nyangs. Hyunyoung sighed in relief, clearly overcome with emotion. He said that it was a relief and that there was only good news. The room fell silent as everyone took in the news. The implications of this discovery were starting to sink in, and a sense of hope filled the air. Someone thought about that kid, Chung Myung, to think that the decision to accept him would bring them such prosperity. It was unbelievable. Someone said that the kid was the harbinger of fortune in the Manhwa sect. It was a lot of pressure to put on a child, but they weren't wrong so far. More importantly, someone slammed their hands on the table, making a loud noise. It was a sign that a decision was being made. The elder stood up from his chair, turning around. He thought that if the account books were real, he would have to confront them. Hyunjong yelled for them to bring in all personnel related to the Great Manhwa's Hua Prefecture business account books. He looked absolutely furious. A few days had passed since the sect leader had demanded the account books. The story was about to move forward. Someone shouted, complaining about being pushed and warning that he was going to fall. He looked absolutely furious. The man stated that they weren't too far from the Manhwa sect and told everyone to keep moving. He then replied to someone with, "Yes, sir." At the top, one of the guys was thinking that after he got his money, he was never coming back to this mountain. And immediately below, another guy was breathing heavily, looking exhausted. The men wondered why the sect leader had suddenly called them to Manhwa. They questioned if he had already prepared the money. The group made their way up the mountain path, each step bringing them closer to Manhwa. One of the men muttered that 100,000 nyangs wasn't exactly pocket change, highlighting the significant debt at stake. One of the creditors figured that Haegun Jeong was probably calling them to beg for mercy. He didn't think there was any way the sect leader could get that much money in such a short amount of time. Another man speculated that there was no point in dragging things out until the promised date. That was probably why Haegun Jeong was calling them in early, he thought. One of the creditors scoffed, saying that the sect leader made them come and go as he wished just to beg from them. He added that he'd never seen such a shameless debtor. But another man told him to refrain from speaking of him with such harsh words, even though Hyunjong was currently going through financial difficulties. The shop owner Yu looked anxious, wondering if it was possible that they weren't going to get their money back after all. He looked really concerned. The group of people walked up the mountain. One of them pointed out that the fact that someone from the Southern Edge sect came to this area made it obvious that many people were interested in Manhwa's temple. One of them was really excited about the money. He figured that if he got 5,000 nyangs today, like he was supposed to, he wouldn't have to work for the rest of his life. He wouldn't have to keep running his shop. The group gathered at the entrance to the building. They looked nervous as they waited to go inside. The group stood silently. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. They were all clearly nervous about what was about to happen. When the merchants reached the gates, they all felt conflicted about bringing down the Manhwa sect with their own hands. The sect had been the protector of the Hua Prefecture for hundreds of years. If they didn't give in to the sect leader today, the Manhwa sect wouldn't even last 7 more days. Knowing this, they climbed up Mount Hua with heavy hearts. They were there to receive their debt, which had increased to a substantial amount of money over time. Shop owner Yu had a serious look on his face as he walked up the stairs. He seemed determined to get what he was owed. The group continued to walk towards the building. They were about to meet with the sect leader, and the tension was building with every step. A man greeted them with a deep bow. He announced that they had arrived and were expected. The man explained that the sect leader was waiting for them. He asked them to follow him that way, to where Hyunjong was waiting. The sect leader paused for a moment, lost in thought. He seemed to be considering his next words carefully, knowing the weight they carried. The merchants finally arrived at the sect leader's residence, ready to discuss the debt. The air was thick with anticipation, and everyone was eager to hear what he had to say. One of the merchants bowed deeply, showing respect to the sect leader. He announced that they humbly greeted him, signaling the start of the meeting. The sect leader welcomed everyone, thanking them for answering his call and climbing up the mountain. Immediately, one of the merchants replied that it was no problem at all. One of the merchants said that even though they were busy, they could never be busier than the sect leader. He added that it was a given that they were the ones to come visit him. The sect leader chuckled, suggesting they have a cup of tea since they must be worn out from climbing. The merchants were all lined up, bowing low. The sect leader was facing them, listening intently to what they had to say. One of the merchants spoke up, explaining that they were just lowly merchants and wanted to get straight to the point without any extra stuff. He seemed eager to get the meeting underway. Hyunjong listened to the merchant, a slight smile forming on his face. He seemed to be considering their request, his expression thoughtful. The sect leader replied that he understood, saying he might have been a little inconsiderate. He seemed to be adjusting his approach based on their directness. Hyunjong then explained that the real reason he had called them all the way up there was to tell them the Manhwa sect's official position on their business. He was about to lay down the terms. From a distance, the Manhwa sect looked peaceful, but things were not good. Someone explained that they had contacted many people, but they still couldn't find anyone willing to lend them money. Hyunjong sighed heavily. He admitted that he wouldn't be able to repay the debt when it was due. Hyunjong stood silently, listening to all of this. The sect leader's expression was unreadable, but the situation was clearly tense. One of the merchants stepped forward, telling the sect leader that they had already given him more than enough time. He explained that they were merchants who needed to make a living and couldn't afford to wait any longer. The merchant looked directly at Hyunjong. He emphasized that this was precisely why he was bringing all of this up. One of the merchants spoke up, saying that even though they couldn't repay the entire debt, they could at least repay part of it. He hoped that would be enough to satisfy them for now. The merchant continued, wondering if anyone there would be willing to delay the repayment date. He was clearly hoping for someone to show them some mercy. Another one of the merchants pleaded with them to do the Manhwa sect a favor and show them some mercy. He bowed deeply, hoping to sway their decision. The atmosphere in the room was getting weird. Down below, one of the merchants looked nervous and uncertain. The narrator said that the atmosphere had started to flow in a strange direction. Everyone was on edge, waiting to see what would happen next. The group of merchants stood outside, waiting. The person in front of them was thinking hard, trying to figure out what to do next. The person watching thinks to himself, wondering if that's how Hyunjong is handling things. He looked a little surprised, as if he hadn't expected this. He still didn't understand what was going on. The guy looked completely lost in thought. He wondered if Hyunjong was trying to push the merchants into a corner, or if he was just being nice. It could honestly be either one, he thought. But one thing he knew for sure was that Hyunjong wasn't as simple as he looked. The guy seemed deep in thought. The most important thing a sect leader needs is to be calm. The scene then shifts to a building. Even though the Manhwa sect is a place where many Taoists live, martial arts are the base of the sect. So, making smart choices should come naturally, especially for the sect leader. The back of a man's head is shown. Does Hyunjong have what it takes to be a good sect leader? The man stared intensely. Hyunjong explained that he had already said he couldn't give them any more time. He asked them not to misunderstand him. The merchant clarified that he wasn't just talking to pavilion owner Kong. He seemed serious about whatever he was saying. Hyunjong explained that even though the Manhwa sect owes 100,000 nyangs, he owes a unique amount to everyone there. He was trying to be reasonable. Hyunjong paused for a second. He seemed to be thinking about what to say next. Hyunjong then asked if anyone would be kind enough to let them delay the repayment date. The sect leader was trying to appeal to their good nature. The man thought that Hyunjong was resorting to pitiful trickery. He looked annoyed. The man asked if that meant Hyunjong was able to immediately repay those who refused to comply with his request. He seemed to be calling calling Hyunjong's bluff. Hyunjong explained that even though the Manhwa sect has decayed significantly compared to the past, that didn't mean they had nowhere to turn. He added that even though they couldn't prepare the entire 100,000 neongs, they could prepare a portion of it. He was trying to sound confident. Hyunjong then pleaded with them. He promised that in the name of the Manhwa sect, they would make sure to repay the debt of those who were willing to show mercy on them today. He looked desperate. One of the merchants spoke up, questioning if Hyunjong even knew what he was talking about. He asked if it meant that if they delayed the repayment date, he would repay them in the future. The merchant looked skeptical. Hyunjong confirmed that was precisely so. He seemed determined to make it happen. Another merchant spoke up, asking Hyunjong something. He pointed out that it wouldn't be strange for the Manhwa sect to collapse any day soon, and surely he himself and everyone there realized that. He seemed to be doubting the sect's future. One of the merchants pointed out that trusting Hyunjong's words and delaying the repayment date would come with the risk of potentially not receiving their payments. He looked at the others for confirmation. Another merchant chimed in, asking for what reason anyone would comply with his offer. The man seemed to be pressing Hyunjong for a good answer. The merchant stared intently, waiting for a response. He wasn't going to let Hyunjong off the hook easily. Hyunjong didn't say anything for a moment. Looking down, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Hyunjong finally spoke, saying that he was asking for them to do it for the name of the Manhwa sect and for its history. He looked up, his eyes filled with determination. One of the merchants grinned, asking if that wasn't enough. He laughed, clearly not impressed by Hyunjong's appeal. Another merchant yelled at Hyunjong, calling him sect leader. He looked absolutely furious. One of the merchants asked if Hyunjong wasn't being a bit too unreasonable. The man looked like he was about to explode with anger. At the same time, the other merchants were yelling at Hyunjong, clearly backing up the first merchant's point. Hyunjong paused, looking down for a moment. He then asked if they were saying that he was being unreasonable. The sect leader's eye twitched, showing his rising anger. Hyunjong said that he would like to answer their question with another question. He was clearly not backing down from this confrontation. Hyunjong asked what the Manhwa sect meant to everyone there. He continued, questioning if the name and history of the Manhwa sect carried any value at all. The sect leader continued, questioning who would dare to treat the name of the Manhwa sect lightly. He pressed on, asking who would dare to dismiss its history. Hyunjong explained that they may have weakened over the years, but the Manhwa sect had always been with the Hwa prefecture this entire time. He added that the Manhwa sect had passed on its energy and spirit over the generations and continuously shared it throughout the entire prefecture. Hyunjong continued, saying that he would like to humbly ask of them something. Meanwhile, one of the merchants looked down, seemingly contemplating something. Hyunjong asked them to reflect on what the Manhwa sect meant to them. The merchants looked at each other, seemingly unsure of what to say. Hyunjong spoke up, saying that he would like to suggest something to everyone there. He looked around, waiting for everyone to pay attention to what he had to say. Hyunjong gestured, directing people to move to one side. He then told everyone that those who were willing to personally delay the repayment date should stand over there. Hyunjong continued, telling everyone that those who were not willing to delay should stay standing where they were. The atmosphere was tense, with everyone unsure of what to do. Hyunjong then warned that everyone was responsible for their own actions. He wanted to make sure everyone understood the risks involved. Hyunjong added, clarifying that those who decided to delay the repayment date would not be protected by the Merchant Alliance. The sect leader emphasized that this was the case even if they ended up not receiving their payments. The speaker told everyone to choose where they wanted to stand. He looked around, waiting for them to make their decisions. The tension in the air was thick as everyone considered their options. The merchants started murmuring among themselves, clearly unsure of what to do. They looked at each other, trying to gauge what the others were thinking. At the same time, another group of merchants also mumbled, hesitant to make a decision. The merchants were still unsure, not knowing what to do. The air was thick with uncertainty. But below, a man smirked, clearly pleased with how things were going. Someone spoke up, saying, "Look at what we have here, sect leader." The speaker seemed amused by the situation. The man opened his arms wide, gesturing to the crowd. He pointed out that no one was willing to personally delay the repayment. The merchant clicked his tongue, clearly disappointed. Shop owner Yu walked away from the group, and immediately, someone asked if that was shop owner Yu. Hyunjong stared intensely. He seemed to be thinking about something. Someone shouted at shop owner Yu, asking what he thought he was doing. The others watched with anticipation. Shop owner Yu asked them not to look at him like that. He admitted that he knew he was doing something stupid, but he had something to say. The sect leader looked on, waiting to hear what he had to say. Pavilion owner Kong told them that he wasn't from the Hwa prefecture. He had a serious look on his face. Since since he didn't have any connection to the Manhwa sect. He said they probably didn't realize something. There was a fire in his eyes. He continued, saying they didn't understand what the Manhwa sect really meant to the Hua prefecture. He looked like he was about to explain. He explained that everyone who grew up in the Hua prefecture grew up hearing stories about the Manhwa sect. The man's expression was serious. He added that they always heard the phrase, "You also need to enter the Manhwa sect and become the world's greatest martial arts master." He seemed to be making a point about the sect's importance. Pavilion owner Kong looked serious, like he was about to drop some truth. His expression was intense, as if he was remembering something important. And even if people realized they weren't good enough to join the Manhwa sect, they still heard stories. The speaker said they kept hearing how the Manhwa sect protected this world. Shop owner Yu suddenly interrupted, asking what they were talking about. He added that he wasn't the only one who grew up hearing those stories. Shop owner Yu explained that it was the same for his father and grandfather. Because of that, he said the Manhwa sect was the pride of the Shanxi province and the Hua prefecture. Shop owner Yu warned that if they left after taking the money, it would be over for them. He said there were many places like Hangzhou City where they could spend their money. Shop owner Yu wondered where he would even go with the money he got. He had lived his whole life in the Hua prefecture. He asked if they were giving up such a large sum of money for something so small. Hyunjong told him he would regret his choice. He seemed confident in his words, like he knew something they didn't. Shop owner Yu admitted that he had only looked forward to getting his money and not having to work ever again. He looked conflicted, like he was having second thoughts. Shop owner Yu was thinking that he must have gone crazy to say such things. He seemed to be struggling with his decision. At the same time, his fist clenched tightly, showing his inner turmoil. Shop owner Yu trailed off, lost in thought. It was clear he was wrestling with something important. Shop owner Yu stepped forward, addressing the group. He said that he already made enough money to live comfortably. He seemed pretty confident in his position. Shop owner Yu continued, making his point clear. He added that even if he didn't get the money, he could just see it as a small regret. The shop owner seemed determined to stand his ground. Shop owner Yu then declared that he would regret causing the Manhwa sect to fall apart. He said he would feel that regret until his dying breath, even if he got a ton of money. The man seemed to be speaking from the heart. Shop owner Yu looked up, his expression firm. He stated that he didn't want to live a life filled with that kind of regret. It was clear that he had made up his mind. Hyunjong smiled slightly, listening to the man's words. He told shop owner Yu to do as he pleased. The sect leader said it wouldn't change anything if just one person decided not to take the money. The man's face was shown in a close-up. He asked who said there was only one person. He seemed to be hinting that more people would refuse to take the money. As he spoke, a group of people walked down the hallway. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the building. They were heading towards where Hyunjong was. The group of people stood together, wearing serious expressions. At the same time, one of the men looked up, a question mark floating above his head, clearly surprised by something. Hyunjong stood tall, his expression unreadable, as he faced the people before him. The sect leader was flanked by two individuals, their faces partially obscured, adding to the tension in the room. Hyunjong closed his eyes, a deep breath escaping his lips. The sect leader seemed to be steeling himself, bracing for whatever was about to happen. The man in green looked at the others and said that he was plenty satisfied with the fact that there were still those who held a meaningful connection to the Manhwa sect. He looked hopeful that they could come to an agreement. Hyunjong called out to Onam to bring it there right away. Onam agreed immediately, acknowledging the sect leader's command. A box filled with books was placed on the ground with a thud. The sound echoed slightly in the room. The books were old and worn, but they were neatly stacked. Someone gasped, realizing what they were looking at. Someone recognized them as the business account books of the Hua prefecture. The man looked shocked and confused. One of the men addressed the crowd and said that the Manhwa sect had been generous to them and their families for many generations. He seemed to be reminding them of their past. The man's expression changed as he accused them of betraying the sect instead of paying what they owed. He looked absolutely furious. The man's face was covered in sweat as he looked utterly terrified. He looked like he was about to have a heart attack. A foot slammed down, emphasizing the threat. The man declared that, according to the account books, the Manhwa sect would be taking over their businesses. He continued, saying that they would also be taking all the wealth they had gained through those businesses, down to the very last coin. The merchants looked stunned as the man walked. One of the men shouted at the sect leader, demanding what he was talking about. The crowd looked on, waiting for an explanation. Another man stepped forward, accusing the sect leader of taking over all the businesses. He said it was just as he had predicted. Another man told the sect leader that his joke had gone too far. He looked serious, not finding any humor in the situation. The Sect leader replied that it was a shame that they thought he would have the time to joke around with them. He looked annoyed by their accusations. Another voice spoke, but the Sect leader cut him off. He slammed his hand down on some papers, looking absolutely furious. The man looked at the account books in his hands. He asked how they could prove that the account books were real. The speaker looked at the group of people. He asked if they were saying that the Manhwa sect had forged the evidence, adding that he was sure the Manhwa sect would never do that. The Sect leader spoke to the man, trying to reason with him. He asked how he could be so sure that he wasn't being tricked by what were presumably fake account books. The man listened to the sect leader's words. He replied that he understood where he was coming from. The sect leader ordered Unam A to bring the leader of the finance and economy agency to him. Unam replied that he would. Sect leader. The man looked closely, thinking about the account books. He said the validity of the account books was something they had to consider. Hyun Young agreed with the man. He said that it was certainly something they had to take into account. Another man chimed in, agreeing with Hyun Young. He added that even the leader of the finance and economy agency agreed, saying it was as expected of pavilion owner Kong. But the man with long hair paused, turning to look back at the group. He seemed to be thinking hard, then said, "However," the man continued, looking down thoughtfully. He explained that since they had expected something like this to happen, Hyun Young raised his hand, explaining that they had already sent half of the account books to the Hua prefectural office to get them appraised. He seemed confident that this would solve the problem, but another man looked absolutely furious. He shouted that this was insane, clearly not happy with the situation. The realization hit everyone at once. They had been tricked, and it was clear this was a big problem. The text explained that if the government soldiers started taking over the businesses while they were away, they wouldn't be able to stop it. As a result, the merchants would lose everything. The text revealed the sect leader's plan. Calling them there was a trick to make them leave the market. The crowd realized they had fallen into a trap and looked worried about what would happen next. The text emphasized that 2 days was more than enough time to check the account books that they had sent away. It was a race against time. The man realized they had only sent half the books, and the ones in the chest must have already been checked. He looked shocked by this realization. The text stated that the government soldiers were waiting for them to leave so they could take over the businesses. The man looked absolutely furious as he realized the implications. Someone shouted for the SEC leader, clearly upset about everything. The SECT leader immediately yelled back, telling the man to lower his voice. He said that the man had no right to raise his voice at him. The SECT leader addressed the crowd, saying that true friendship comes from helping each other when they're in need. He looked confident as he spoke to the crowd. The men looked worried, and the SEC leader continued. He stated that there was no need to help those who had betrayed them when they needed help. The men looked even more nervous after hearing that. The SECT leader told them to head back immediately. He added that everything would be over once they arrived in the Hua prefecture. There was a coldness in his tone. The sect leader continued, saying that if they were to do things how they were supposed to be done, they would have taken over everything they owned. But he said, considering the hard work they had put in until now, he would allow them to take a cartload of their wealth with them. He seemed to be enjoying this. The man said that he would never forget this, and immediately he turned and walked away, his steps heavy with anger. The men started walking away, clearly upset. At the same time, a group of people looked downward, their expressions unreadable. The sect leader's words hung in the air, and immediately a man looked up, listening intently. The sect leader continued, saying that nothing changed the fact that their businesses belonged to the Manhwa sect, and naturally, it would return to their possession. Hearing this, the man in the doorway seemed to be listening carefully. The SECT leader said that he would permit everyone there to continue running their businesses and taking the profit for themselves. He looked confident as he made the offer. The SECT leader added that he would like to discuss how things should be run in order to benefit both parties, inviting them to come inside. The people looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Shop owner Yu was thinking that even though he was in a better position than those who sided with pavilion owner Kong, he still got demoted from a shop owner to a stand-in owner in an instant. He seemed really upset about it. He sighed, wondering what his grandfather had done. As he pondered, the scene shifted to a distant landscape. up. Meanwhile, a man suddenly shouted, asking what was going on and who told Hyunjong that he could give away a cartload of their wealth. He looked absolutely furious. He continued yelling, asking who Hyunjong thought he was to give away a portion of the Manhwa sect's wealth. The man's anger was palpable. At the top, people were pulling carts looking normal. However, down below, Hyunjong looked furious. The soldiers explained that after they climbed down Manhwa, all of the businesses were taken over by the government soldiers. They added that if it wasn't for the sect leader's request, they would have lost everything. A man looked up, yelling Pavilion Owner Kong's name. He regretted listening to that scumbag. Another man yelled Pavilion Owner Kong's name. He asked what they were supposed to do now. The man demanded that Pavilion Owner Kong say something. He reminded Kong that he had told them to trust him. At the same time, a cartwheel was shown. The man looked furious and asked if he was being blamed for everything. He seemed ready to explode. The man denied blaming him for anything. He stammered, trying to explain himself, and immediately, someone slammed a stick on the ground, making everyone jump. The man in red told everyone there was no need to get worked up. He said they would only be in this position temporarily. He then asked how those account books could possibly be real. The man yelled that those were fakes. He insisted that the sect leader had forged them. One of the guys pointed out that the prefectural office had validated them. He added that he had taken a peek at the contents, and they all seemed legit. The man in the red robe was clearly upset. He said they probably set the whole thing up with the representative from the prefecture. He looked like he was about to explode with anger. The man's face was red with fury. He told everyone to head to Luoyang City for now. He looked determined to take action. The man clenched his fist tightly, veins popping out. He declared that if they were using authorities to push them down, they would have to oppose them with even bigger authorities. He was clearly not backing down. The man scoffed, calling it garbage. He was clearly frustrated with the situation. Everyone else looked just as annoyed. Meanwhile, someone dressed in all black was lurking in the forest. The figure seemed to be watching and listening carefully. The air was thick with tension. The man in the red robe asked if the figure in black was the one who had been speaking. He was interrupted by someone coughing nearby. The coughing man wanted to know who else was there. The coughing got worse. The guy in charge pointed out that the person was wearing a thief's costume in broad daylight. He wondered if the bent back meant he was an old man. The man in the red robe warned the thief that he should just leave if he was aiming for their wealth, or he would lose his life for nothing. He seemed serious about the threat. The thief asked if he was talking about his wealth. The thief yelled that he wasn't trying to steal someone else's wealth. He was just trying to get back his own. He sounded absolutely furious. The man in the red robe looked confused by this statement. He seemed to be thinking about what the thief had just said. The man in the thief's costume asked if they were from the Manhwa sect. He looked like he was waiting for an answer. The thief grinned, saying that it was good timing because now he could get revenge on them. He seemed excited about the prospect. Suddenly, a group of men in black thief costumes charged forward. They looked like they were ready for a fight. The eyes of one of the men narrowed as they prepared to attack, and immediately, the group swarmed the wagon, swords raised. One of the men in black looked down at his target. His eyes were filled with a cold fury. The thief moved with incredible speed. The air cracked as he swung his weapon. The thief lunged forward, sword raised. The other man barely managed to block the attack. The thief didn't give him any room to breathe, and immediately, he followed up with a brutal punch. The force of the blow was intense. It sent shockwaves through the air. The other thieves joined in the attack all at once. Beams of light flashed as they tried to overwhelm their target. The thief moved with incredible speed. He was ready to attack. At the same time, the other man stood his ground, waiting for the right moment to strike back. The thief stood over the bodies of his defeated opponents. He warned that they didn't realize what they were up against. The man with the beard spoke with a menacing tone. He said that no one had ever defied him and lived to tell the tale. The man started sweating, realizing the strength of his opponent. He ordered his useless subordinates to back off. They were groaning on the ground. The man wondered where someone like the thief had been all this time. He added that if he had stepped in earlier, the Manhwa sect wouldn't have fallen so far. The man stepped forward, ready to fight. He warned that the thief had picked the wrong time to interfere. The thief was ready to fight. He declared that he would kill the man and send his body back to the Manhwa sect as a warning. The man with the glowing hands spoke with confidence. He said that the sect leader would be sad to hear that someone like the thief died by his hands. The man shouted, telling the thief to prepare himself. He looked absolutely furious. The thief realized that the man had been hiding his true power. He knew that there was no way someone who just owned an inn could be this strong. He was impressed. The man spoke to the thief with a smirk. He warned that he wouldn't beat up the thief's mouth too badly. He looked confident, and immediately, the thief was sent flying through the air. The force of the blow was so strong that it looked like he was launched from a cannon. The man added that he needed the thief to be able to speak at least. He was clearly planning something. Suddenly, a massive explosion ripped through the forest, shaking the ground. The trees were torn apart, and the air filled with smoke and dust. Someone was channeling energy into their hands, preparing for a fight. He thought that he certainly didn't let his guard down. The man was struggling to get back on his feet, clearly hurt. He thought that the #1 rule for martial arts practitioners is that they must not look down on their opponents. The man was sweating and panting, pushing himself to his limit. He thought that it is said that tigers give their best even when they hunt mere rabbits. The man stared intently, his body tense. He remembered watching that masked man single-handedly take down all the escort warriors, and he wouldn't even think about letting his guard down. The man was still channeling energy into his hands. His face twisted in anger. He pointed out that his opponent was making a face as if he was getting bored. The man didn't waste any time and attacked, promising to fix that bored expression of his opponent. The force of the blow sent the man flying through the air. He crashed through the trees, leaving a trail of broken branches behind him. The attacker didn't give him a chance to recover and pressed his attack. He swung his sword down with incredible speed. The man managed to block the sword, but the force of the impact was immense. His arms trembled as he struggled to hold his ground. Raw energy surged around the man's hands, crackling like lightning. It was a terrifying display of power, like he was about to tear the world apart. The man in red gritted his teeth and screamed as the energy started to backfire. He looked like he was in serious pain. The man in red groaned, explaining that his arm got blocked before he could extend it. He felt the inner energy that had gathered up in his arm refluxing, causing him pain. The masked man watched him struggle and said that he was a slowpoke. He recommended that he stop trying. The man in red looked up, his face contorted in pain as he heard a warning. The masked man told him that his fingers would be the ones to break first if he kept trying. The masked man gathered energy under his feet. The power crackled, ready to be unleashed in a devastating attack. The masked man unleashed a spinning kick. It was a revolving kick, charged with immense power. The kick sent the masked man flying through the air at an incredible speed. He moved like a blur. The masked man's kick landed squarely on the man in red, sending him flying. The man in red was shocked, barely able to say, The man in red crashed to the ground, defeated. He coughed, struggling to get back on his feet. The man in red screamed as he gathered all his energy into his hand. The power crackled around him, ready to explode. The masked man stood over the man in red, completely calm. He warned that he had already told him his fingers would be the first to break. The man in red thought to himself, is he fast? He knew the answer was definitely not. The man in red looked at his own trembling hand. Then is he strong? He knew that the answer was definitely not. The man in red realized the masked man was certainly neither fast nor strong. So how was he losing so badly? The man in red looked at the masked man, thinking he looked weak. He thought that just judging by his looks, he could take on 10 like him at once. But the moment he tried to strike, the masked man was already moving. The attacker was sent flying from a kick, realizing he couldn't land a single hit on his enemy. Lying on the ground, the man in red tried to figure out what was going on. Even though the masked man was slow, he moved with perfect timing, direction, and distance, making no wasted moves. The man in red started to get scared, feeling like he was fighting something not human. It almost felt like the masked man was a goblin. Completely out of breath, the man in red knew he was in deep trouble. The masked man was seeing through all of his moves, and he realized that this man was a monster, far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The man in red was panting, sweat dripping down his face. He admitted that he didn't think he could keep fighting like this for much longer. The masked man stood there, barely breaking a sweat. He said he wanted to play a little longer, but that he was also running out of energy. The man in red looked up at the masked man, his voice strained. He asked why someone like him hadn't helped the Manhwa sect all this time. Suddenly, the legs of the masked man moved with incredible speed. The ground crunched beneath his feet as he dashed forward. The masked man stood tall, his sword now drawn and glinting in the light. He asked why he should tell anything to someone like the man in red. The man in red scoffed, sweat dripping from his brow. He told the masked man that blabbermouths like him lived in strange delusions and that he shouldn't answer anything he asked. The masked man countered that he should be the one asking questions. He wondered why someone with such skills would waste his life running an inn in the Hwaom prefecture. The man in red shot back, asking if there was a law that stated strong martial artists weren't allowed allowed to run an inn. The masked man insisted that there definitely wasn't a law like that. But with the man in red's skills, there were probably many other ways to earn money without running an inn, he said. The masked man quickly denied having a secret scheme or any bad intentions. He insisted that he hadn't received an order from anybody. It was his own decision. The masked man scoffed, saying that was correct. He knew it, and that's what they all say. He thought how uncreative the man in red was being. The masked man pointed a finger, declaring that he had one last question to ask. The masked man asked the man in red if he knew what he did to people like him to get answers. The man in red wondered how he would know. The masked man stated plainly that he beat the hell out of them. The man in red looked confused, not sure what to make of the masked man's words. The masked man figured there was no point in wasting time trying to dig out information from those who weren't going to speak anyway. So he said there just needed to be a little compromise between him and them. The masked man made it clear. If the man in red made sure not to tell him the information he needed, he would make sure to beat him up enough to satisfy himself for not getting to hear it. The masked man then launched a kick at the man in red. The man in red realized the masked man was aiming for his left knee. He braced himself, sweat dripping down his face. The man in red thought that at this speed, he could block the masked man's attack. He tensed his muscles, preparing for the impact. The masked man's kick slammed into the man in red. The force of the blow sent the man flying backwards, crashing into a nearby table. The man in red screamed, wondering why his shoulder was hurting. He was so sure the masked man was aiming for his knee, so why the sudden change of target? The man in red looked up, his face twisted in pain. He couldn't believe what was happening to him. The masked man didn't give him a chance to recover. He was already coming down with another kick, this time aimed straight at the man in red's head. The man in red screamed, realizing the next attack was coming for his head. He was sure of it. The masked man's foot connected with the man in red's head. The force of the impact echoed through the room. He could feel the blood trickling down his face, but he couldn't even focus on it. All he could do was look up. The man in red screamed, choking on his own blood. I could clearly see the attacks with my own 2 eyes. He managed to cough out. The masked man was still moving, still attacking, and yet the man in red wheezed, trying to get air into his lungs. He knew what was coming. He could see it, but his body wouldn't respond. I could not dodge a single blow, he shouted, his voice cracking. The man in red felt his strength leaving him. He knew it was over. I will most definitely die at this rate, he thought, accepting his fate. The masked man stared intently at his opponent, focusing on his eyes. He thought he knew something just by looking at them. The masked man's eyes narrowed as he examined his opponent's face. He realized that he was facing the eyes of a killer, someone who had slaughtered countless people. The masked man didn't waste any time. He moved with terrifying speed, his sword a blur of deadly motion. The man in red looked up, fear etched across his face as he saw the blade coming down. He begged for his life, not wanting to die. The masked man didn't even look back. He simply turned and walked away, his job done. The man in red screamed as the attack landed, the force of it making him cough. He couldn't believe what was happening to him. The energy erupted from the point of impact, tearing the earth apart. The force of it was massive. The air cleared, revealing the sky above the trees. The quiet was almost deafening after the explosion. A hand crackled with energy, the source of the devastating attack. The air around it shimmered with heat. The man gasped, sweat pouring down his face as he focused the energy. It was taking a lot out of him. The man's eyes widened in disbelief as he recognized the technique. Tai Yi godly palm technique, he asked, shocked. The man in red robes stared down at the masked figure, trying to understand what was happening. He could only manage to say, "You." The masked man looked up, his eyes glowing with a strange light. He demanded to know if the man in red was from the Southern Edge Sect. The masked man spoke with a cold edge to his voice, pointing out the ridiculous coincidences. He asked if the man ran an inn in the Hua Prefecture, led merchants to collect debts from the Manhwa sect, and just happened to be a practitioner of the Southern Edge sect's martial arts. The masked man stood over the man in red robes, his voice hard. He wanted to know if the man had been sent from the Southern Edge sect. The man in red robes cursed under his breath. He realized he shouldn't have used the Tai Yi godly palm technique, especially in front of someone from the Manhwa sect. The man in red robes' face twisted in frustration. He knew he'd made a critical mistake. The man in red robes tried to explain himself. He said if the masked man hadn't suddenly pulled out a sword and tried to cut him down, he wouldn't have used the technique out of panic. The masked man wondered how far ahead this whole thing had been planned, if it was intentional. When the man in red robes refused to answer, the masked man just tilted his head. The masked man said that was fine, and that the man's loyalty was respectable in some sense. He said that it was a very respectable choice. The masked man said he couldn't look down on the Southern Edge sect, even though there had been tensions between the Manhwa sect and the Southern Edge sect for a long time, he couldn't ignore the fact that the Southern Edge sect was prominent and held a firm position as one of the 10 great sects. The masked man scoffed, saying there was no way such a sect would take care of things so poorly. He seemed to find the whole situation ridiculous. The masked man figured the man on the ground probably didn't know much about the details himself. Even if he did, there was no way to make sure his information was valid. All the masked man needed to know was that he was related to the Southern Edge sect. The masked man spat out his words, full of rage. He cursed them, calling them bastards. The masked man continued, saying that even in the worst times, the martial arts world wasn't this dishonorable. He asked if one of the great sects was really trying to steal not just techniques, but the entire sect itself, and by scamming no less. He scoffed at how low they'd sunk. The man in red robes didn't say anything. He just stared into the distance, lost in his thoughts. The masked man tilted his head and asked if it wasn't better for the Manhwa sect. Anyway, he seemed to be enjoying the other man's discomfort. The man in red robes snapped back, his face twisted with anger. He said that the masked man probably already knew that there was no hope left for the Manhwa sect. The man in red robes sneered, saying that now that they've lost their techniques, the Manhwa sect could never be what it once was. He added that it was just a matter of time before they collapsed, and he was simply speeding up the process. The masked man agreed, saying that a sect without the martial arts from its past was doomed to die. He then paused, as if waiting for a response. The man in red robes snapped back, asking who said that. He was clearly furious, and added that he thought someone like the masked man would understand. The masked man tilted his head, his red eyes glowing. He questioned who had said that the Manhwa sect had lost the techniques from their past, demanding an answer. The masked man swung his sword, furious that the other man was spreading lies without knowing the truth. He yelled, asking why he didn't just admit he was doing this because he hated the Manhwa sect. He'd at least accept that as an excuse, since the man in red robes was from the Southern Edge sect. The masked man continued, saying that he had beaten the man in red robes pretty badly. He explained that the Manhwa sect and the Southern Edge sect had many things in common, including strong internal connections and the use of swords as their main weapon for martial arts. The man in red robes was still lying on the ground, completely out of it. He wasn't moving at all. The masked man went on, saying that if two great sects with many similarities were next to each other, one of them was bound to die. The man in red robes insisted that he wasn't from the Southern Edge sect. The masked man scoffed, saying that he wasn't from the Manhwa sect either. The man in red robes yelled at the masked man to stop talking nonsense, and the masked man told him to do it first, calling him a dumbass. The masked man looked down at the man in red robes, his expression changing. He seemed like he was about to do something. The masked man leaned in, telling the man in red robes that he would show him something very interesting if the man in red robes would show him his Tai godly palm technique. Down below, the man in red robes was being held at sword point by another person in black. The man in red robes was sweating, with the masked man's sword pressed against his throat. The masked man continued, saying that if the man in red robes knew what he was talking about, it would be a very interesting experience. The masked man tilted his head, the sword still at the man in red robes' throat. He added that it would be a shame if the man in red robes didn't know what he was talking about. The masked man stared intensely, telling the man in red robes to deliver what he said to the person who sent him there. In a flash, the masked man's sword moved, making a slicing sound. The man in red robes was absolutely terrified. He could feel the cold sweat running down his face as he realized the danger he was in. The masked man moved like a whirlwind, spinning so fast that he became a blur. His sword cut through the air with deadly precision. The man in red robes went flying through the air, completely helpless. The force of the blow knocked the wind out of him. The man in red robes was struggling to keep up with what was happening. He thought to himself that the masked man was so fast. Just swinging his sword created such a strong wind. The man in red robes was still trying to figure out what the masked man was doing. He wondered why the slashes weren't reaching his body and what the masked man was trying to do. The masked man was bleeding, but he didn't care. He declared that plum blossoms give off their strongest scent when they bloom in the snow. The masked man swung his sword, not slowing down at all. He stated that even though it's winter, the spirit of the Manhwa sect is not fading. The masked man and the man in red robes continued to fight, their swords clashing in the forest. The sound of metal against metal echoed through the trees. The masked man continued to press forward, his foot landing heavily on the ground. He added that once spring comes, the man in red robes was on the ground, his face contorted in fear. He was clearly terrified of what was about to happen. The man in red robes held a small branch in his hand, his brow furrowed narrowed in confusion. He looked up, sensing that something strange was about to happen. The masked man held his sword out, ready to strike. He wasn't going to let the man in red robes get away. Plum blossoms started to fall all around them, filling the air with a sweet scent. It was like the mountain itself was promising that plum blossoms would bloom all over. The man in red robes looked up, his eyes wide with shock. He wondered what he was seeing. Hundreds of thousands of plum blossom leaves were falling all around him, covering everything. It felt like the whole world was turning pink. The man in red robes looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He couldn't understand what was happening around him. The man in red robes stared in disbelief, his face frozen in shock. He stammered that this couldn't be happening. The air shimmered as the plum blossom sword technique, the rainfall of plum blossom, filled the area. It was a sight thought lost to time. The man in red robes was on the ground, trembling. He muttered that he must be imagining this. The masked man's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. He was ready to finish this. The man in red robes lay on the ground, completely still. The masked man stood over him, his sword still dripping blood. The masked man stood alone in the open field, panting heavily. He thought to himself that this was going to kill him. His inner strength was still lacking. The masked man sighed, realizing that what would have been child's play for his past self had taken everything out of his current self. He knew he needed to come up with a way to stop this. The masked man looked up, his eyes narrowed. He called out to someone, saying, "Hey, you." The masked man's expression hardened. He demanded that whoever he was talking to come closer to him. The masked man stood at the end of the dirt road, blocking their path. The group of people stood before him, unsure of what to do. The masked man stared at them, his eyes narrowed behind the mask. He wanted to know who wanted to be beaten up before leaving. The masked man tilted his head, as if considering something. Then, he asked who wanted to just leave without being beaten. Immediately, the group of people raised their hands and started shouting. They all wanted to leave, and they wanted to leave right away. The masked man chuckled, sounding almost pleased. He said very well and thanked them for their cooperation. The masked man watched as the people scrambled to get away, each one tripping over themselves in their haste. He just stood there with his arms crossed, completely calm. Suddenly, the masked man shouted, telling them to stop right there. His voice echoed through the trees, stopping them in their tracks. The masked man asked if they really didn't know how to use their brains. He seemed genuinely annoyed, like he couldn't believe how dumb they were acting. One of the people looked back, confused. The masked man asked how he was going to take all of these carts with him if everyone just leaves. He told them to use their brains for once, then paused, as if realizing something. The masked man ordered everyone to report to him how much was on each of their carts, telling them to go. The people immediately responded with a loud, "Yes, sir." The people started shouting out the amounts of money they had, desperate to save themselves. One guy yelled that he had 1,800 nyangs. Another claimed 2,300, and the last one nervously squeaked out that he had 8,000 nyangs. The masked man scoffed, asking if they really had that much money. He told them that it wasn't important right now, calling them dumbasses. The masked man hummed to himself, thinking about the next step. He seemed to have an idea forming in his head. The masked man ordered one of them to go and get the money from the city of Zhenjiang. He told them that he was going to sell all of this to them for cash. The masked man warned them to bring the money under no name. He threatened to kill them if they didn't do that, admitting that he had never seen someone like him in his life. One of the merchants spoke up, wondering what would happen if the person sent to Zhenjiang didn't return. He was clearly worried about the potential fallout. The masked man scoffed at their concerns. He asked them what they even planned to do if they ran away, and if they had any money left besides the carts. The masked man pointed out that the carts were all they had left. He told them that if they wanted to get even those leftovers, they'd have to come back. The merchants looked at each other nervously, unsure of what to say. They were clearly trapped. One of the merchants finally spoke up, asking if they could report him to the government or something. He sounded desperate. The masked man stood over the merchants, sword raised high. The merchants were frozen in fear, knowing they were completely at his mercy. The merchants could only stare up at him, their faces etched with despair. They were nothing but small figures against the vast sky, completely helpless. The masked man stared down at them, a smirk hidden behind his mask. He told them they could try if they wanted, clearly confident that they couldn't. The masked man warned them not to come back, ever. He promised that if they did, he would hunt them down, no matter what it took, chasing them to the other side of the continent. The merchants looked at each other, their faces filled with fear. One of them sobbed, admitting that he couldn't think of any way to escape from this crazy person. Someone barked out orders to get moving. A trembling voice responded, agreeing with a sob. The sound of the bills rustling filled the air as someone counted a huge stack of cash. Each bill was crisp, and new, adding to the satisfaction. Chung Myung looked absolutely thrilled, holding the money close. He thought it was just great. Chung Myung laughed to himself as he ran. He was clearly having a blast. With a running start, Chung Myung leaped into the air. He cleared the wall with ease. The clear water flowed over the rocks in the river, and immediately, someone was drying off with a towel, out of breath. Joe Ghoul was drying off with a towel after training. He complained that today's training was exhausting and asked if they really needed to do this so early every morning. Joe Ghoul smiled. A lot had changed, he thought. They felt like an actual group of martial arts practitioners, but someone yelled at another not to spray water on them. Joe Ghoul noticed Sahyung was smiling and asked what was making him so happy. Sahyung looked at him, a little surprised by the question. Sahyung paused for a moment to think. He didn't know how to explain it. Sahyung finally said that it felt like they were an actual group of martial arts people. At that moment, someone else asked if that was really the case. Joe Ghoul admitted it was a strange thought to have since they've all been martial arts people this entire time. But Sahyung replied that it wasn't strange at all. Sahyung said he had been thinking the same thing. He seemed to be smiling with satisfaction. Joe Ghoul laughed, saying he couldn't have imagined training so hard at the Manhwa Sect just a few days before. He seemed happy with the progress they were making. Someone shouted for the group to start heading back. At the same time, Sahyung agreed, adding that they used to just try to kill time until it was time to climb back up the mountain. He sounded grateful for the change. Yoon Jong looked off into the distance, saying he could feel that things were changing. The young man seemed thoughtful as he spoke. Joe Ghoul commented that it was probably all thanks to Chung Myung. He seemed to be acknowledging the impact Chung Myung had on the group. He added that the guy was undoubtedly bringing changes to the Manhwa Sect. Joe Ghoul seemed impressed by the impact Chung Myung was having. The scene showed a landscape of trees and mountains. At the same time, it was said that although it's only a small breeze as of now, no one knows whether it will remain the same. The text continued, explaining that no one knows whether it will turn into a massive storm that will shake up the entire Manhwa Sect. But whatever the outcome, these changes will surely impact the future of the sect. Someone ran and shouted that they couldn't put that over there. He ordered them to keep it coming. Immediately after, another man yelled that he told them they would start putting things together after getting all the materials inside first, asking if they were deaf. The man continued to yell, warning that if they broke anything, they wouldn't be getting paid for the next month. He told them to come on and carry them faster. As a result, some workers were carrying materials. The same man continued to shout at the workers. At the same time, the workers were carrying the materials. Someone wondered what was happening and who all these people were. Meanwhile, workers were carrying materials into the temple. Someone shouted that something needed to go over there, not here. He seemed really angry about it. The man wondered about Great Sasuk. He looked really confused. Yoon Jong had returned. Someone asked what was going on there, looking surprised. The man realized they were all laborers. He seemed surprised by this. The man explained that they were planning to get the entire temple repaired. He added that the temple was old and not in the best shape. At the same time, two men were listening to him. The roof of the building looked old and worn. It was clear that it needed some work. The man asked what was holding them back. He seemed impatient, waiting for an answer. The man questioned why they weren't helping the workers. He pointed out that they seemed worn out from bringing the carts all the way there. He looked annoyed. The man shouted at them to hurry up and get to work immediately. The two men looked terrified and agreed right away. Chung Myung told the guys to get to work, laughing as he watched them. He seemed to enjoy bossing them around. Suddenly, the sound of murmuring came from inside the building. It was unclear what was going on, but something had clearly caught their attention. The disciples inside were staring at a whole cooked chicken on a plate. It was like they couldn't believe their eyes. The disciples wondered if they were dreaming. They couldn't believe they were seeing meat on the sect's dining table. How was this even possible? The disciples were absolutely amazed by the sight. Their mouths were hanging open in disbelief, completely shocked by the sudden change. The disciples cheered wildly, raising their arms in the air. They were shouting that it was meat, overwhelmed with joy at the sight of the feast. At the same time, someone lifted a piece of meat with chopsticks, savoring the moment. It was like a dream come true after so long. Sahyung thought to himself that the changes Chung Myung brought to the sect might be happening faster than anyone expected. Under the moonlight, someone muttered that they never thought something like this would happen. He was clearly still processing the sudden change in fortune. Meanwhile, a stack of new sect uniforms sat neatly folded. Another disciple added that they had suddenly started constructing construction work to repair the temple. Below, 2 disciples were wearing the new uniforms, looking quite pleased. One of them said that they saw meat on their dinner table, and on top of that, they even got 2 new sets of the Sect uniform, adding that he could still taste the meat in his mouth. Soo-young was smiling to himself, and someone asked him what he was thinking about. He looked pretty pleased with himself. Soo-young turned and replied that he was thinking about how great money was, laughing like a maniac. He was clearly enjoying the newfound wealth. Someone else said that they were amazed by it too. Although they had suddenly gotten their hands on a large sum, it was still hard to believe. Another disciple chimed in, saying that he never thought the higher-ups would bring sudden changes like these. He was still processing the rapid shift in their circumstances. Someone wondered if the leaders had enjoyed being broke the entire time. He added that they had been living poor because they had no choice in the matter. Someone commented that they had never seen Great Sask laugh so brightly. He was laughing so hard that they thought he didn't even know how to laugh. It was a pretty rare sight, apparently. Soo-young was then asked what they should do from now on. The guy seemed to be looking for guidance. Soo-young replied that he was sure they already knew that Manhwa Sect had been going through rapid changes. He added that they should be prepared for what more was to come. Someone else repeated, a bit unsure, that they should prepare for changes. He seemed to be thinking about it. Another disciple chimed in, saying that this wasn't just a matter of financial prosperity. She looked thoughtful. Someone asked if the other had seen the secret martial arts books inside the chest. The other guy confirmed that he saw them too. Chung Myung tripped over a pile of chests and gold bars. He pretended it was an accident, but he revealed the hidden stash with his terrible acting. Someone wondered how he got hold of those things. The other person replied that who knows. Yoon Jong said that one thing was certain. The Manhwa Sect was going through changes. Joe Ghoul. He looked serious. Yoon Jong continued that they would inevitably be caught up in the storm of change brought upon the Manhwa Sect. He added that they must prepare themselves with utmost determination. Someone was worried that if they didn't do things right, they could get swept away by the changes Chung Myung was making. The figure looked small and insignificant against the vast, snowy landscape. Soo-young was worried, but Joe Ghoul told him not to be. He said that he was Joe Ghoul, and everything would be fine. He seemed confident. Joe Ghoul wondered where Chung Myung was. He said he hadn't seen him since that morning. He seemed a little concerned. Soo-young told him that the sect leader wanted to see Chung Myung earlier. He added that the young man was probably in the sect leader's residence right now. Joe Ghoul repeated that the sect leader wanted to see him. Joe Ghoul wondered why the sect leader would want to see Chung Myung. The sect leader's residence was quiet and imposing against the backdrop of the mountains. The sect leader explained that it was only right to reward those who had done something great. The group sat around the table, waiting to see what the reward would be. The atmosphere was calm and expectant. The sect leader leaned forward, saying he wanted to give Chung Myung a reward for everything he'd done. He added that this was the whole reason he'd called him in. The old man seemed earnest. Chung Myung looked surprised and asked if he really wanted to give him a reward. The sect leader confirmed it and asked if there was anything he wanted. The young man's eyes widened slightly. The sect leader suggested that Chung Myung might still want the money he'd given to the Manhwa Sect. He offered to return some of it if he wanted. He seemed to be considering the offer. Chung Myung said he wasn't really interested in wealth. The sect leader asked if he was sure he didn't want it. He explained that he wouldn't have anywhere to spend it on Manhwa anyway. The sect leader thought that Chung Myung understood the way of the Tao. He added that it wasn't easy to let go of attachments to wealth. The old man seemed impressed by the young man's lack of interest in money. At the same time, Chung Myung was thinking that the sect leader probably couldn't give him much wealth anyway. He already had more than enough in his secret storage. The young man looked uninterested. The sect leader suggested that Chung Myung could tell him something else he wanted. He offered to allow him to learn an advanced technique that he normally wouldn't be allowed to learn yet. But Chung Myung replied that he didn't really want techniques either. The sect leader asked if Chung Myung didn't want them either. He seemed surprised and asked if he wasn't interested in learning advanced techniques. The old man was clearly trying to find something to offer. Chung Myung said that there must be a reason their ancestors established an order in which they learned the techniques. The sect leader realized that he was right. He agreed that there was a proper order to things. Chung Myung scoffed at the idea of following the traditional order. He thought that he should be the one teaching the sect leader advanced techniques. The young man seemed annoyed by the whole situation. He knew that there were so many techniques that he needed to teach them. The young man wanted to give them all the techniques he knew. He wondered how he could hand them over the techniques naturally. Chung Myung was starting to get a headache from thinking so hard. He didn't think he should have to think so hard about something like this. He wondered what he wanted as a reward. The young man also thought about what else he could do for the Manhwa sect, of which only its name remained. He was determined to help the sect. Suddenly, the sect leader had an idea. He seemed to have realized something important. Chung Myung asked if he could go to the Hwa prefecture whenever he wanted, emphasizing that he needed freedom first. He explained that he needed to be able to move around in more places before he could do anything. The sect leader considered Chung Myung's request to go to Hwa prefecture. The young man agreed, saying that having to only stay in the temple while practicing martial arts was limiting his growth as a disciple. Chung Myung asked if he wouldn't be able to learn by exploring the broader world. The others listened quietly, seemingly curious about the answer. The sect leader said that he understood where he was coming from, but the old man was quick to point out that it would be violating the Manhwa sect's regulations. The sect leader admitted that his achievements were more than worthy of allowing him to do that. However, he was worried that there may be people who complain about it being unfair, making Chung Myung think he was being too picky. Chung Myung asked if there was anything else the sect leader wanted from him. He wondered what more could be asked if he couldn't even get permission to go to the Hwa prefecture once in a while. He looked annoyed. Chung Myung put his head down on the table, pretending to be in pain. The young man was clearly trying to get his way by any means necessary. The boy dramatically called out to the sect leader, claiming his body was in terrible shape. The sect leader looked at him suspiciously and said that he could see that. Chung Myung continued, saying that according to the doctor, his inner energy seemed to be damaged. The sect leader admitted that he had heard that as well. Chung Myung finally got to his point. He said that was why he would like to ask for some pills of life. Chung Myung asked for pills of life, the kind that could replenish his health. He was very insistent about it. The sect leader listened to what he had to say. At the same time, Chung Myung was blushing, looking like he had high hopes. The sect leader took a sip of his tea. He seemed to be thinking about what Chung Myung had asked. The sect leader declared that Chung Myung no longer needed permission to go outside the Manhwa sect's temple. He made the statement very officially, but Chung Myung had to stay inside the Hwa prefecture. The boy was confused because the sect leader had said he wouldn't allow that. The sect leader said that Chung Myung would need to take full responsibility for what happened when he was outside the Manhwa sect's temple. He finished with, "That's all," and immediately, Chung Myung was at the door. He asked the sect leader about the pills of life. Chung Myung was still standing at the door, waiting. He looked confused because the sect leader wasn't answering. Chung Myung shouted, asking what the hell. He demanded the sect leader give him some pills of life because he was dying out there. But the sect leader responded that he didn't even have pills of life for himself, calling the young man a brat. He said he'd rather die than suffer like that. The sect leader put his hand on the door, ready to leave. He asked what the other person thought about Chung Myung. He was curious about their opinion. Hyun Song replied that Chung Myung definitely understood the way of Tao. He added that the sect leader felt that as well. He seemed confident in his assessment. The sect leader said that although Chung Myung was a young child, he could sense his wisdom from the way he spoke. He was clearly impressed by the boy's maturity. The others listened intently. Hyun Sang agreed that even though he came off as rough at times, considering his young age, it was understandable. He nodded in agreement. He thought that Chung Myung's behavior was acceptable. Hyun Sang continued, saying that when he talked to Chung Myung, it didn't feel like he was a young child. He seemed to be in awe of the kid. The man was very impressed. The sect leader thought to himself that it wasn't just the way Chung Myung spoke that was so striking. He couldn't sense any childishness from the boy. He was trying to find the right words to describe it. The sect leader continued to ponder, admitting that he could sense the spirit of a Taoist from him. To think that he could feel that from a child was unbelievable. He couldn't find a better way to describe it. The sect leader turned to Hyun Sang and asked what he thought about Chung Myung. He looked at him expectantly. Hyun Sang seemed surprised by the question. Hyun Sang replied that he didn't really have an eye for evaluating people, especially not like the sect leader. However, he figured that the sect leader must have felt something special when he saw Chung Myung, right? The sect leader thought about it for a moment. He mused that Chung Myung was like a child that was not childish. He seemed to be deep in thought. Hyun Sang looked thoughtful as he spoke. He said that the sect leader wasn't the only one who felt that way about the kid. He seemed to be agreeing with the sect leader's assessment. The sect leader listened intently. He explained that children who are deep thinkers or have lived hard lives tend to develop such characteristics. He gestured slightly with his hand as he spoke. The sect leader continued, his expression serious. He clarified clarified that it wasn't just about being mature for his age. He felt that the way Chung Myung talked and acted made him seem like an actual adult, even an old man. Hyun Sung paused, a concerned look on his face. He asked if that meant Chung Myung was corrupt inside, but he immediately added that he didn't mean it that way. He seemed to be thinking something over. The sect leader didn't reply immediately. He just stared off into the distance, deep in thought. The silence hung heavy in the room. The man with his back turned said he understood the sect leader's point. He told them not to read too much into things, reminding them that Chung Myung was just a kid. The sect leader agreed with him immediately. The sect leader explained that the Manhwa sect existed to nurture people, not to use them. He added that if they found a great talent, they needed to help them grow and guide them through any problems they faced. Hyun Sang replied that he was absolutely right. He seemed to be agreeing with everything the sect leader said. The sect leader then turned to Onam, asking how the construction was coming along, but he trailed off with a simple "oh" as he waited for the report. Onam reported that because the mountain was so steep, they were having trouble getting enough wood for the construction. Down below, workers struggled to cut and move the heavy logs. The worker smoothed out the log with his plane. He explained that even though they were cutting down all the trees they could find, it still wasn't enough. He added that they would still need a few more days to dry and trim the trees they had already cut down. The sect leader, Hyun Jong, listened intently and just said he understood. Onam then asked if the sect leader was upset that he cared so much about the temple's appearance, especially since they finally had some money to spare. He seemed worried about how his efforts were being perceived. Hyun Jong laughed, telling him not to worry and to understand that he had good intentions. He added that the Manhwa sect needed to be rebuilt after all. The sect leader explained that when people made new resolutions, they needed to organize their surroundings and correct their behavior. He said that this was the most effective way to communicate those resolutions to the disciples. Hyun Jong clasped his hands together and agreed, saying that the sect leader was absolutely right. He looked calm and collected as he spoke. Hyun Young then turned to Se-young, asking him to finish interpreting the new techniques they had acquired as soon as possible. The other man, Sa-hyung, turned to face him and listened intently. Hyun Young warned that they couldn't afford to make any mistakes because the fate of the entire Manhwa sect depended on how well they taught those techniques to the disciples. The weight of responsibility was heavy on their shoulders. Hyun Sung clasped his hands together, bowing his head slightly. He promised that he would make sure not even the slightest mistake was made during the interpretation. The sect leader looked at both Hyun Young and Hyun Sung. He told them that he was putting his full trust in the two of them to get the job done right. Hyun Jong wondered if he should tell him right now. He was deep in thought, his brow furrowed with concern. The sect leader seemed to be weighing his options carefully. He thought that the technique books were strangely new, considering it had been at least 100 years. The sect leader looked doubtful as he considered the possibilities. Hyun Jong continued thinking that he hadn't noticed when they first discovered it because he was in shock, but there were even ink marks, almost as if someone was in a rush writing the books. The sect leader then thought that he would be going too far. After all, the contents of the books were without a doubt the real deal. He shook his head, dismissing the idea. Hyun Jong realized that meant there was someone who was helping the Manhwa sect, but had to keep their identity a secret. The sect leader wondered who would do such a thing. Chung Myung was furious. He couldn't believe the sect leader had kicked him out just because he didn't want to give him a pill of life. He stomped his foot, muttering under his breath. Chung Myung was still angry, asking what good it was for him to rewrite all the technique books before handing them over. He glared at the book, clearly annoyed by the whole situation. He continued to write, complaining about the damned sect that not even a beggar would want to take over. The young man's face was red with frustration. Chung Myung, seeing the sect leader's expression, knew he had lost the recipe for the pill of life, along with all the money the sect had. He thought that this sect was done for. Chung Myung looked down, admitting that this was really a pain in the butt. He sighed, realizing the trouble he was in. Chung Myung was surrounded by swirling pink energy, trying to recover. He admitted to himself that he expected there to be side effects to a certain degree, but this was proving to be more difficult than he thought. Chung Myung looked frustrated, putting a hand to his head. He realized that the side effects were way more severe than he had imagined, and he was starting to get worried. Chung Myung looked down, sighing deeply. He realized his body wasn't healing as quickly as he thought it would, and at this rate, it might take half a year for complete recovery. The young man was not happy about that. Chung Myung stood still, deep in thought. He knew it was very bad for someone as young as him to lose out on an entire half a year of training. It was a critical time for building inner strength. Chung Myung's expression hardened with determination. He knew that once you missed this ideal period of time, it would never come back. The young warrior needed to find a way to recover, and fast. Chung Myung knew there were basically two ways to recover his pure innate chi. He could either eat a pill of life life, or get help from someone who could transfer their chi to him. But the thing is, there was no way for him to find someone who could transfer their chi to him at the moment. It wasn't like he could just ask anyone. Chung Myung remembered that back in the day, pills of life were everywhere around the sect. Well, maybe he was exaggerating just a little bit. He could practically feel the smooth texture of the pill in his hand, like it was yesterday. Chung Myung even used to take the plum blossom pill as a hangover cure. He couldn't believe how much things had changed. Chung Myung remembered how effective the pills were. He admitted to himself that he really wanted a drink now. He thought back to the days when he could drink as much as he wanted without getting caught by Se-young. He would just pop a pill, and the hangover would be gone instantly. The young boy was lost in his memories, thinking about the good old days and how easy things used to be. He paused for a moment, and then it hit him. Hangover relief? Chung Myung's eyes widened as he realized something important. A thought sparked in his mind. His eyes darted around as he remembered something. He knew where they were. The young man's face lit up with excitement, a plan forming in his mind. Pills of life. Chung Myung's eyes sparkled with determination as he remembered the secret place. He was ready to go get them, no matter what it took. Chung Myung sprinted through the forest, determined to find the secret stash. He was sure that the pills were hidden somewhere around here. He kept running, pushing himself through the dense forest. He repeated to himself that the pills should be right there, somewhere close. The young boy ran faster, reminding himself that his bad memory was actually helping him this time. He was getting closer to the pills. He could feel it. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the forest. Chung Myung finally stopped, panting heavily as he looked up. He was sweating, and his heart was pounding in his chest. Chung Myung stood at the bottom of a massive cliff. The air was thin, and the climb looked almost impossible. The cliff was known as the ruggedly disconnected cliff. Just looking at it made his stomach drop. It was said to be the most dangerous and steep cliff among the 5 great mountains. The legends surrounding it were enough to scare anyone away. Chung Myung looked up, realizing the place he was searching for was somewhere in the middle of this incredibly steep cliff. He muttered to himself that he must be crazy to even consider this. This was a secret place that only Chung Myung knew about, even within the Manhwa sect. And in the middle of the cliff, there was a small cave that could only be found by climbing up the cliff. Chung Myung thought that this cliff was off limits to disciples for training because it was too dangerous. But thanks to that, he had found the best place to hide from Se-young. He admitted it had been a great help to him. He realized that he had been able to do things like drink without being seen by Se-young, or eat meat without being seen by Se-young. He could even take a midday nap without Se-young noticing. Chung Myung wondered why Se-young even let him live. Even when he thought back to it, he wouldn't have left someone like him alive. Chung Myung knew that wasn't what was important right now. Anyway, he prepared himself for what was to come. Somewhere up there, Chung Myung knew that the pills of life he hid away in his past life were waiting. He was determined to find them. Chung Myung looked up at the cliff. He thought that if it was his past self, he would have been able to get up there with only 2 jumps, but he knew there was no way he could climb up with his current body. Chung Myung kept walking. However, he had an idea in mind. Chung Myung walked along the edge of the cliff, dragging a rope behind him. He seemed to be searching for something specific. Chung Myung stood at the edge of the cliff, looking down at the steep drop. He wondered what if he climbed down instead of climbing up. Chung Myung peered over the edge, his face showing a mix of excitement and fear. The young man realized that the only problem about it was that it's about 10 times more dangerous. Chung Myung told himself that he only lived once, so he should just go for it. He looked determined to face whatever was coming next. He quickly corrected himself, realizing that it was technically his second life. The young man was still getting used to the idea of reincarnation. He was having second thoughts. This was going to be harder than he thought. He was getting really frustrated with the whole situation. He had to find a way to make this work, Chung Myung shouted, wondering why it was so damn hard to revive the Manhwa sect. He was starting to feel like it was an impossible task. The steepness of the cliff wasn't the only reason it was banned as a training ground for the disciples. The text wondered why the ruggedly disconnected cliff was named that way. It was a mystery that needed solving. Just as its name suggested, it was a very rugged and steep cliff. There wasn't anywhere to step or grab on. The climber looked like he was in a really tough spot. The climber's foot slipped off the rock face. He was starting to fall. He looked like he was in real trouble now. In other words, this cliff was very difficult to climb. It was clear that this was no ordinary training ground. The challenge was immense. The climber fell through the air, arms outstretched. He was completely helpless. It looked like a long way down. Chung Myung was falling, and he knew it was over. He screamed that he was gonna die. The view from below showed just how far he was falling. He was really going to die, he thought. Suddenly, he stopped falling. He was hanging from a rope, suspended in mid-air. The rope had saved him, he realized. That was why you had to be prepared, he thought to himself. But then he started sliding down the rope. He quickly used the QI suction technique. The young man was trying to stop himself from falling any further. Chung Myung focused intensely, trying to absorb as much chi as possible. He needed to stop himself from sliding down any further. The effort was visible as energy gathered in his hands. Chung Myung was still hanging on the cliff, trying to hold on. He was clearly struggling, but he was determined to make it. He had to find a way to survive this. Chung Myung was in pain as he hung there. He complained that his bones were breaking like twigs. This body was too weak, he thought with frustration. Chung Myung looked up, his expression changing. He realized something important, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Chung Myung could see it. He realized that he could see the entrance to his hideout. The rope he had prepared according to the estimated distance was barely able to reach the entrance. Chung Myung was thinking fast. He realized that he'd need to grab onto the cliff on the other side first. He looked determined, knowing this was his only shot. He knew what he had to do. Chung Myung realized he first needed to stop using his chi suction technique. The young man needed to gain some momentum if he wanted to survive. The rope was starting to stretch dangerously thin. It looked like it was about to snap at any moment. He swung through the air, relying on the rope. Chung Myung was flying, hoping his calculations were correct. He was putting everything on the line. He stretched out his hand, desperate to grab something. Chung Myung was reaching for the cliff face, his fingers outstretched. Landing this was going to be close. He timed it perfectly. Chung Myung shouted, knowing this was his last chance to grab onto something. But the rope couldn't take the strain anymore. It snapped, sending pieces flying in every direction. He was falling faster than ever. Chung Myung looked up, confused by what he was seeing above him. He realized something was wrong. The young man shouted that this wasn't the cliff he was aiming for at all. He didn't have time to think. Chung Myung yelled, using his chi suction technique, but screamed in frustration. What the hell was going on? Chung Myung was falling down the cliff, completely out of control. He was spinning around and around as he fell. Suddenly, he slammed into the side of the cliff. The young man grunted in pain. At the top, the rope finally snapped under the strain. As a result, Chung Myung started sliding down the cliff face. He managed to grab onto another rope that was hanging down. The warrior dangled there, trying to catch his breath. He hung there in silence, thinking about his situation. The young man was really in a tight spot. Chung Myung landed hard on the ground. He was completely still for a moment, not moving a muscle. It looked like he had finally stopped falling. Chung Myung suddenly sat up, looking furious. He yelled that the Plum Blossom Sword Saint was a crazy bastard. He looked around at the cave. At the same time, he wondered what the Plum Blossom Sword Saint had been thinking, making a hideout in a place like this. He looked even more confused. The warrior wondered if he had gone crazy because of all the training. Chung Myung's eyes widened in realization. Oh, right, he thought. That's him. Chung Myung was lying on the ground of the cave. He was talking to himself and said that he had somehow managed to get into the cave, even though he almost died doing it. He was still holding onto the rope. His hand was gripping it tightly, showing how close he had come to falling to his death. Chung Myung then threw a cloth onto the ground. The sound echoed through the cave as the cloth landed with a soft thud. Chung Myung got up and looked around. He could see a bed, a table, and other supplies in the small hideout. Chung Myung noticed a nightlight crystal. He wondered why the Plum Blossom Sword Saint would bring something like that to a hideout, and how much it was worth. Chung Myung was standing in the cave, looking at the nightlight crystal. He was talking to himself, realizing that he was the Plum Blossom Sword Saint. He admitted that he kept forgetting about it. There was a sound of something heavy dropping. Chung Myung looked absolutely exhausted, his face covered in dirt and sweat. He was breathing heavily, trying to catch his breath. Suddenly, there was a ray of hope. A treasure chest and a jar came into view. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Chung Myung was standing in his old hideout, looking around. He said to himself that the plum blossom pills he had hidden away should be there. The young man was hoping they would help him recover his body. The sound of the jar opening echoed through the cave. Chung Myung looked surprised, his eyes widening. He didn't expect to find what he was looking for so easily. Chung Myung approached the chest, and as soon as he opened it, a rich plum blossom fragrance filled the air. It was as if fully bloomed plum trees were right there in the cave. He couldn't believe it. The chest contained snow blossom pills. He had even hidden away the snow blossom pills, which were way more expensive than the plum blossom pills. And there was more. This other chest was full of plum blossom pills. The plum blossom sword. Saint really was a madman, he thought. Chung Myung sighed, hoping no one would get too angry at him for hiding all these pills. At least he didn't hide the most expensive pill of life here, he thought with a nervous chuckle. Chung Myung knew what he had to do. He needed to completely recover his body first, before anything else. Chung Myung figured it would be great if he managed to build up a bit of inner strength while he was at it. He held the pill between his fingers, looking at it intently. There was no need for hesitation, he thought. He would take a snow blossom pill first. The young man swallowed the pill without a second thought. The pill started to take effect, and a soft glow began to emanate from within him. The light pulsed gently, spreading warmth throughout his body. The energy condensed into a small, bright orb. It floated in the darkness, a beacon of hope in his current situation. The energy focused on his back, converging at a single point. He could feel the power coursing through him, slowly revitalizing his body. The pill melted in his mouth before he could even chew, and a sweet smell spread throughout his body. He could feel the effects almost immediately, but he didn't have time to enjoy the scent, he thought. He needed to focus on the task at hand. The young man knew he had to get this right. First, Chung Myung thought, he needed to make sure the chi from the snow blossom pill didn't escape from his body. He had to be careful. He repeated to himself that he had to hold it in. He focused all his energy on keeping the chi inside. The warrior was determined to succeed. The energy began to condense into a small, bright orb. It was a sign that his efforts were paying off. Chung Myung knew he couldn't use the pill to recover his inner strength in its current state. It was too impure, he thought, and he frowned at the realization. Turns out, even though snow blossom pills were the pride of Manhwa Sect, they had way too many impurities for him to store inside his body. He grimaced, realizing the problem. Chung Myung knew he needed to purify it. Although he would need to throw away most of the chi that was stored inside the pill, he felt he had no other choice. He looked determined. After all, he was taking the long way to build up the most complete and perfect foundation he could ever get. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Although it wasn't an easy decision to make, he decided he couldn't let his impatience get the best of him. He had to be patient. Chung Myung decided he would throw away everything other than the purest chi. The energy swirled around the small crystals, ready to be discarded. He looked down at the small pile of crystals, thinking about how much of the original pill was now gone. It was such a waste, he thought to himself. Chung Myung decided he would take the small pieces remaining after filtering out the impurities. The crystals glowed softly. He would store them inside his dantian. The crystals began to glow brighter. The young man planned to send the crystals all the way into the deepest parts of his dantian. He wanted to reach the innate, pure chi. The crystals began to glow even brighter, pulsing with a soft, pink light. The energy seemed to be resonating with something deep within him. Suddenly, the crystals started to crackle with energy, little sparks flying off them. The air around them seemed to vibrate. Then, all the energy focused into one small ball of pure pink light. It pulsed gently, like a tiny heart beating. The ball exploded outward, sending waves of energy in every direction. The raw power was almost blinding. The energy rushed into a dark cave, illuminating the stone walls with a faint glow. It felt like something significant was about to happen. Suddenly, a surge of raw energy exploded outwards. The force of it was immense, shaking the very ground beneath him. The energy swirled around him like a raging storm, and immediately, the ground beneath him began to crack and split from the force. Chung Myung was at the center of it all, meditating as the energy continued to pulse. He sat there calmly, despite the chaos around him, his face contorted in pain as the energy surged through his veins. He could feel the power coursing through him, almost too much to bear. Chung Myung screamed,